Along the silent roads of Suffolk, bodies began to appear, each one a message no one can decipher. As the darkness tightens its grip, whispers of a faceless killer spread, leaving a community trapped between fear and the unknown. Hear the entire story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. Now enjoy the stories. Hola, Joel. My name is Maria, and although I think I'm a little older than your usual crowd, I think my story is just as scary as any other. Back when I was just 21 years young, I went on a date with a guy in my home state of Florida. Since it was our first date, I felt nervous as hell just sitting across from this guy I'd met at a friend's party a week earlier. His name was Roddy, short for Rodrigo, and he seemed really nice. He had a cute smile, he was kind of shy, and he worked at a record store downtown. This was 1983, and Miami was buzzing, and I was excited for our first date at this little Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. I'd never been there before, but everyone said the food was amazing and it had this cozy vibe with colorful tiles and old photos on the walls. Roddy picked me up at my apartment and we drove to the restaurant in his beat-up Chevy, and I wanted to make a good impression, but I was already second-guessing everything by the time I got there. The air was warm and sticky. It was typical Miami, and the radio played some new wave song that I pretended to like. And I just remember fidgeting with my bracelet, trying to calm my nerves. And then when we walked into the restaurant, the smell of roasted pork and fresh coffee hit me, and I started to relax a little. The place was packed. Families were laughing and waiters rushing around, and we got a small table near the window, and I remember thinking how the streetlights outside made everything just feel alive. We ordered some food, and I was just starting to feel like maybe this date wouldn't be a disaster. Roddy was telling me about some vinyl he'd found at work, and I was trying to act interested even though I wasn't big into music. I sipped my soda and I glanced out the window every now and then. The street was busy, with cars cruising by and people walking under the neon signs, and everything felt normal, like any other night in Miami, and then it happened. I didn't even realize what was going on at first. There was this loud pop, like firecrackers, and the window next to us shattered. Glass sprayed everywhere and I froze, my heart pounding harder than I'd ever felt before. The pops kept coming, fast and sharp, and people started screaming. I ducked under a table, my hands over my head, not even thinking, just moving on instinct. I could feel bits of glass under my palms. My dress was probably ruined, but I didn't care. All I could think was, please God, I don't want to die. And Roddy was under the table with me, and his face I remember being pale as a ghost. I could hear plates crashing, chairs scraping, and more screams. The gunfire kept coming, but it wasn't like in the movies. It was messy, chaotic, so loud that my ears were ringing, and I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like forever. I was shaking. My breath was coming in these short gasps, and I couldn't stop picturing someone bursting through the door to finish us off. I didn't know what was happening or why it was happening. All I knew was that I was terrified. When the shooting finally stopped, it was like the world held its breath. There was this terrible silence at first, one that was eventually broken by people crying or shouting in Spanish. I stayed under the table, too scared to move. Roddy grabbed my hand, and even though it felt weirdly intimate for our first date, I let him. But my mind was racing. Were we safe? Was the shooter gone? Or was he just waiting for round two? I kept thinking about my mom, how I hadn't called her that day, and how I might never get the chance ever again. And somehow, I think it was a waiter, yelled that everything was over, and for everyone to stay calm. I peeked out from under the table. The restaurant was a mess. There were tables flipped over, food spilled everywhere, glass glittering on the floor like little razor-sharp pieces of confetti. People were huddled together, some crying, others checking on each other. I saw an older woman holding a napkin to her arm with blood seeping through and staining the white fabric. But thankfully, that was the worst injury I saw. Nobody seemed to be dead, and although I felt a wave of relief, my body wouldn't stop shaking. Roddy helped me to my feet, and for a few seconds we just stood there looking around and not knowing what to do. The air smelled like something burning and spilled coffee. My ears were still ringing, my legs felt like jelly. I noticed my dress had a tear at the hem, and for some reason, that there made me want to cry. It was such a stupid thing to care about when I just thought that I was about to die, but all of it just kind of hit me really hard. I kept thinking it was supposed to be a fun night, but somehow it turned into a nightmare. Police sirens started wailing outside, and soon there were cops everywhere asking questions and telling us to stay put. I heard someone say it was a Cuban dissident, someone angry about politics who shot up the place to make a point. They didn't want to kill anyone, they just wanted to wreck the restaurant. And I didn't understand any of it. Why that place? Why that night? I felt this weird mix of relief that no one was seriously hurt, but also an anger that someone could be so evil as to ruin a normal night and put people's lives at risk, all for nothing more than politics. And before we left, me and Roddy gave our statements to the police. I don't even remember what I said. My mind was foggy, but once we were done, they told us we could leave. Roddy offered to drive me and I nodded, still too shaken to argue and not wanting to be alone. We didn't talk much on the way back. The radio was off and the city felt different, like it had shown me a side that I didn't want to see. When we got to my apartment, I just sat in his car for a minute, not ready to be alone. He asked me if I was okay, and I said yeah, even though I clearly wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of the gunfire and the way the glass exploded, the way my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I kept thinking about how I'd been so worried about my hair or whether Roddy liked me, and then the world turned upside down in a second. It made everything feel so fragile, like anything could happen at any time. Roddy called the next day to check on me, and we talked a little about what happened. We went out again a week later, but it wasn't the same. The spark was gone, maybe because we'd shared something so intense too soon, and I didn't blame him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the date had been doomed from the start. The restaurant stayed closed for a while, and I never went back, even after it reopened. I couldn't imagine sitting there again, eating like nothing had happened. And for a long time I got nervous in crowded places. Every loud noise made me jump, and I'd see a car backfire, hear a door slam, and feel that same panic in my chest. I started avoiding Little Havana altogether, which was silly because it wasn't the neighborhood's fault. I just couldn't handle the memories. But over time, things got better. I went on other dates and laughed and felt normal again. But obviously that night stuck with me like a scar that you forget about until you catch a glimpse of it. It was the night that I learned how quickly everything can change and how you can plan for a perfect evening and end up hiding underneath a table, praying you'll make it out alive. So I've been a listener for a while and I love your stories, and I think that you might like to read one of mine which involves my terrible dating life. His name was Jay and we'd matched on an app. He seemed confident, maybe a bit cocky, but in a charming way. He was a dude from a rough part of town, always posting about his souped-up car and flashy sneakers on social media. Hood rich, I guess you could call it. Big attitude, bigger dreams, but probably not much in his bank account. Still, he had a vibe and I was curious. He suggested we go for a drive, maybe grab some food somewhere low-key, and it sounded fun, so I said yes. I've been looking forward to the date for days. I got ready that evening, keeping it simple, jeans, a cute top, some sneakers in case we ended up walking somewhere, and Jay pulled up outside my flat in this really loud and shiny car. The thing was decked out with tinted windows, had some low suspension, and a very bass-heavy sound system that actually rattled the windows before I even stepped outside. And he leaned out the driver's side window, kind of smiling, and I hopped in. And the car smelled like air freshener and this leather polish. He was wearing a tracksuit, all designer and a gold chain that looked heavier than it needed to be. I thought he was trying a bit hard, but I guess I didn't mind. He seemed excited to show off. And we drove through the city. Music was blaring, and I was having a decent time. Jay was chatty, telling me about his car and how he'd saved up for the mods and how he'd been in a few street races. I wasn't actually sure if he was exaggerating, but I just kind of nodded along. And the streets were busy, lights were flashing, and I was starting to relax and thinking this might actually be a fun night. And he asked if I wanted to see what the car could do, and I just shrugged, thinking he'd just rev the engine or something. But that was a big mistake. We pulled onto a quieter road, and Jay's whole vibe changed. His smile got wider, and he started driving faster, way faster. The speedometer climbed, and my stomach flipped as the car roared. I gripped the seat, trying to play it cool, but I was clearly nervous. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to seem boring. And he was weaving through traffic, cutting corners, and I could feel the car vibrating underneath me. And I kept thinking that he'd slow down, but he didn't. And then I heard it. Sirens behind us. At first I thought it was just an ambulance maybe, but Jay's face got excited. He glanced in the rearview mirror and swore under his breath. I turned around and saw these flashing lights behind us, and my heart sank. Police, 2 cars, maybe 3 right on our tail. I asked what was going on, but Jay didn't answer. He just floored it. And the car pushed forward, and I was just pinned in my seat. We were flying now, way over the speed limit, dodging other cars like something out of a movie. My hands were sweaty and my chest was feeling tight. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but my voice was just stuck, like a dream. The sirens were louder, closer, and I could see the police cars in the side mirror, and their lights were blinding me. Jay was focused, hands gripping the wheel, but I could tell that he was panicking too. The city started to blur past. Street lights, buildings, everything just looked like a streak, and I didn't know where we were anymore. We hit this long stretch of road, and I thought that maybe we might actually lose them. But the police didn't stop. I heard a loud bang, and the car swerved hard. My head slammed against the window, and I remember yelling. Jay shouted something, but I couldn't make it out over the noise. I looked back and saw one of the police cars had rammed us. The rear of that BMW was crumpled, and the back windshield was cracked. I realized later it was one of those pit maneuvers that I'd seen on TV where they hit your car and try to make it spin out, and if you asked me, it worked a little bit too well. The car started to skid, the tires were screeching, and we spun across the road before coming to a stop. I was shaking, my ears were ringing from the impact. Before I could process what was happening, there was another crash, and glass exploded everywhere. The driver's side window was suddenly gone, shattered by something heavy, maybe a baton, I have no idea. I just remember screaming, covering my face as those shards started to rain into the car. My window was the next to smash, and I felt the air rush in. I looked up and there were police everywhere, surrounding us. The cars were angled to block us in, lights flashing so bright that it was hurting my eyes, and I saw guns. Actual guns, not just like stun guns, pointed right at me through the broken windows. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might explode. I froze, hands up trying to show that I wasn't a threat. Jay was yelling, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. The police were shouting too, telling us to get out with our hands up. And I was terrified, but I managed to open the door and stumble out. The road was cold under my feet, and I realized that I'd lost a shoe somewhere in the chaos. My hands were trembling as I held them above my head and kept my eyes down, too scared to even look at the officers. They grabbed me, not roughly but firmly, and pulled me away from the car. I saw them drag Jay out, pinning him to the ground. He was still shouting, something about how they had no right, but they weren't listening. I was led to the side of the road where an officer started asking me questions. They wanted to know my name, what I was doing, if I knew why Jay ran. And I told them it was our first date, that I had no idea what was going on. My voice was shaky, and I felt tears filling up in my eyes, but I held it together. The police searched me, checked my bag while I stood there, shivering and humiliated while cars slowed down and their passengers were just staring at us. And the police kept me there for what felt like forever, asking the same questions over and over. And I told them I barely knew Jay, that I'd literally just met him online, but I could tell they didn't fully believe me. They said the car was flagged for something. It was stolen maybe, or linked to a crime. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. All I could think about was how I'd ended up here on the side of the road, surrounded by cops with guns, all because I thought a drive with a guy might be fun. And eventually they let me go. They didn't arrest me, thank God, but they took my details and said they might call later. Obviously, Jay wasn't so lucky. He got cuffed and shoved into the back of a police van, and I didn't stick around to see what happened next. One of the officers drove me home, and I sat in the back of the car staring out the window. When I got to my place, I locked the door, sank onto the couch, and just sat there trying to process everything. My phone was blowing up with texts and calls from friends, and they were most probably wondering how the date went, but I honestly couldn't bring myself to answer. I eventually deleted Jay's number, unmatched him on the app, and swore that I'd never go on a date ever again. All I wanted was a fun night out, and instead, I got to experience what it was like to pretty much play Grand Theft Auto in real life. I'd been excited about my date with Alexei. He was a handsome Greek boy, successful and wealthy, and everything that sounded perfect on paper. We met through a mutual friend who said he was a great catch, and when he asked me out to lunch, I thought it could be fun. I got ready and headed to the fancy restaurant that he'd picked out. It was one of those places with white tablecloths and waiters who kind of hovered, and I felt a little out of my element, but I was ready to give it a chance. And the date started off okay. Alexei showed up in a sleek car wearing a tailored suit, and he had this confident smile that made me think he was used to getting his way. We sat down, and I noticed that he didn't even look at the menu before ordering for both of us. Now, I thought it was a bit odd, but I let it slide, figuring that he just wanted to take charge. The food came quickly, and I tried to make small talk, asking about his work and his hobbies, and he answered in short, clipped sentences, like he was too important to bother with details. It felt like he was sizing me up instead of actually listening. And then I noticed how he treated the waiter. When the guy brought the wrong wine, Alexei snapped at him. His voice was sharp and cold, saying that he shouldn't have to explain himself to someone who couldn't do their job right. The waiter apologized, but Alexei kept going, calling him incompetent with this low, cutting tone. And I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't just impatience, it was cruel. I tried to change the subject, but Alexei barely acknowledged me, like I was just there to fill a seat. He rushed through the meal, checked his watch every few minutes, and when the bill came, he tossed his credit card down without even looking at it. I offered to split it just to be polite, but he waved me off, saying it was nothing. By the end of lunch, I knew that I didn't want to see him again. His controlling vibe, the way he treated people, it was a hard pass, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make a scene, and honestly, I just wanted to get home. My car was in the shop, so I'd taken a cab to the restaurant. When Alexei offered to drive me home, I hesitated, but it was a long way back and I didn't have much cash for another cab. I figured that I could handle a short ride, smile, and say goodbye forever. We got into his car, and at first it seemed fine. He asked for my address and I gave it to him, expecting a quick trip. But as we drove, I noticed that he wasn't heading toward my neighborhood. The city streets turned into quieter roads and then into winding country lanes with nothing but fields and trees. I asked where he was going, trying to keep my voice calm, but he just sort of smirked and said he was taking a scenic route. And at that point, my heart started pounding. Now, this was well before cell phones, so I had no way of calling anyone, no way to tell anyone where I was. I was just alone with some guy, and the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The countryside stretched out, empty and endless. No houses, no gas stations, just open fields and the occasional barn. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I asked again, more firmly, to take me home. Alexei's demeanor changed. His voice got low, and he said he'd figured me out. He thought I'd used him for a free lunch, that I'd played him by letting him pay and acting like I was interested when I had no intention of seeing him again. He'd said I'd wasted his time and his gas money, like I'd tricked him on purpose. I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to mislead him, that I just didn't feel a connection, but he wasn't listening. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He looked at me, his eyes were very hard, and he said he could drive me deeper into the middle of nowhere. He said he could do whatever he wanted, and no one would find me for days, maybe weeks. And my whole body seized up. I didn't know if he was serious or just trying to scare me, but at that moment, I believed he could do it. I was trapped in his car, miles from anywhere with no way to get help. And I felt so small, so helpless, and I started begging him to take me home. My voice was shaking, trying to keep him calm. I told him I was sorry, that I didn't mean to upset him, anything to get him to turn the car around. He didn't say much after that. He just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel, while I sat there, my heart racing, watching the empty fields roll by. I kept thinking about how no one knew where I was, how I'd made a mistake getting into his car. I thought about my family, my friends, and how I might not see them again if this went wrong. It felt like hours, though it was probably less, before he finally turned the car around. He didn't say why, didn't explain. He just started heading back toward town, and I didn't dare say anything to risk changing his mind. When we finally pulled into my neighborhood, I felt like I could breathe again, but I was still shaking. He stopped in front of my apartment and I reached for the door handle, desperate to get out. Before I could, he grabbed my arm, looked me in the eye and said that he could have done anything to me out there, and no one would have stopped him. He said I should remember that. And then he let go, and I stumbled out of the car, barely able to stand. I didn't look back as he drove off. I just ran inside, locked the door, and sat there trying to process what had happened. I reported it to the police the next day. I was scared, but I couldn't let it go. I told them everything, how he'd driven me out to the countryside, what he'd said, and how he'd made me feel like my life was in his hands. They brought him in, but Alexei told a completely different story. He'd said he'd just driven me home like I'd asked, and that he'd taken a longer route because he wanted to talk and that I was overreacting. He played it off like I was some dramatic girl making a big deal out of nothing. The cops listened to both of us, but there wasn't much evidence, just my word against his. In the end, they let him go with a warning. I was furious, but I wasn't surprised. He was rich, charming when he wanted to be, and he knew how to spin a yarn. The way that he made me feel so powerless, and I started double-checking my locks at night, looking over my shoulder when I walked home. I never saw Alexei again, and I was grateful for that. But the whole thing left a mark. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a reminder of how quickly things can turn, how someone can seem perfect on the outside and still be dangerous. I learned to trust my gut after that, to listen when something feels off, and I never let anyone drive me home again unless I was absolutely sure that I could trust them. My name's Camille, and I'll be honest, my dating history was a mess. I've been on dating apps for a while, swiping through profiles, hoping to find someone different. I always seem to end up with the same kind of guys, though. Mean, rough, and if I'm being honest, sometimes violent. A lot of them were into some pretty edgy stuff, like drug dealing, or they were MMA fighters with egos that were bigger than their biceps, and I was pretty much tired of it at that point. I wanted something better, someone who wasn't like that. So when I matched with this one guy, we'll just call him Tom, I actually felt a spark of hope. And his profile seemed normal. He had a steady job, liked hiking, and didn't come off like he was trying to prove anything. We started chatting, and he was kind and funny even. And I told myself this could be a fresh start. We texted for a couple of weeks, and I opened up a bit about my past. Not everything, but enough to let him know that I'd been with some bad guys and was trying to move past that phase of my life. And he didn't judge, which was nice. He listened, asked questions, and seemed to get it. And eventually we decided to meet up. I suggested a place on the outer limits of the city, a quiet little pub that I'd been to once or twice. It wasn't exactly fancy, but it was far enough from my usual haunts that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. Or so I thought. I got to the pub and grabbed a table near the back. Tom showed up right on time, and he looked just like he did in his pictures. Average height, brown hair, very kind eyes. And he smiled when he saw me, and I relaxed a little. We ordered some drinks and started talking, and it was easy, just like our text messages. We talked about his job, my love for old music, and random stuff like favorite places to eat. And it felt good, like maybe I'd finally met someone who wasn't completely toxic. And about an hour in, Tom excused himself to use the toilet. I stayed at the table sipping my drink and feeling pretty hopeful. I was thinking about how maybe this could work, how maybe I could leave my old life behind. But when Tom came back, he seemed a bit off. Not upset, just sort of distracted. I asked if everything was okay, but he brushed it off and said it was nothing. I didn't push him though. We just kept talking, but I could tell that something had definitely shifted. He wasn't as relaxed anymore. I wondered if I'd said something wrong, but I couldn't think of anything. We finished our drinks and decided to call it a night. It was getting late and the pub was starting to empty out. Tom offered to drive me home, which I appreciated. I didn't live too far, but it was nice not to have to take a bus or call a cab. We walked out to his car, parked in a dimly lit lot behind the pub, and the air was chilly and I pulled my jacket even tighter. And that's when I noticed a group of people hanging around near the edge of the lot. They looked pretty rough, skinny, twitchy, like they hadn't slept in days. I knew that look. I'd seen it too many times before. I grabbed Tom's arm and whispered that we should hurry. And he nodded and we picked up the pace. But before we could get to his car, the group started moving towards us. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, and I recognized one of them, a guy named Johnny. And he used to hang around with one of my exes, a dealer who had been bad news from the start. I hadn't seen Johnny in years, but I knew that he was trouble. I didn't say anything to Tom, I just wanted to get out of there. They got to us before we could reach the car, though. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, started shouting, asking who Tom was and why he was with me. Tom tried to stay calm, saying that we were just leaving, but they weren't having it. They started circling us, and I saw one of them pull out a crowbar. Tom grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the car, but they weren't letting us go that easily. The guy with the crowbar swung at the car, smashing the side mirror. Another one kicked the door, leaving a dent, and I screamed, and Tom yelled at them to back off, but that just made them laugh. Tom unlocked his car finally, and we jumped in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the seatbelt. The group was still banging on the car, shouting, but Tom didn't wait. He started the engine and peeled out of that lot. I remember the tires screeching. I looked back and saw them standing there, still yelling something, but thankfully they didn't follow us. My heart was racing and I could barely breathe. I kept saying that I was sorry, over and over, like it was my fault. Tom didn't say much, just kept his eyes on the road. The drive to my place was quiet, and I felt awful. I knew these guys were probably connected to my past, and I hated that Tom had gotten caught up in that. I kept thinking about how I'd wanted this to be different, how I'd wanted to leave all of that stuff behind, but I guess it followed me anyway. When we got to my flat, I turned to Tom and apologized again. I told him I didn't know those guys would be there and that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He was kind about it, said it wasn't my fault, but I could tell that he was shaken. His car was messed up and he'd just been through something very terrifying because of me. And before I got out of the car, Tom said he'd like to see me again. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could try again, that this was just a bad night. And I smiled and said that I'd like that too. I went inside, still feeling shaky but holding on to a tiny bit of hope. Maybe he meant it. Maybe we could get past this. But a few days later I texted him and he didn't reply. I waited a couple of more days and tried again. Nothing. I checked the app and he'd unmatched me. I realized that he must have deleted my number, and It hurt, but I couldn't blame him. That night was a nightmare, and I knew it was because of me, because of the mess that I'd been trying to escape. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd ruined my chance at something good. I'd wanted so badly to change, to find someone who wasn't part of that world. But it felt like my past was never going to let me go. I thought about reaching out again, maybe explaining more, but I didn't. I figured he'd made his choice and I had to respect that. And I felt embarrassed, ashamed even, if I should have picked a different place or told him more about my past up front, but it was done. All I could do was try and move forward, keep trying to leave that old life behind, and I told myself that I'd be more careful next time if there was a next time. I just hoped that one day I'd meet someone who could see past the mess and give me a real chance. I'd been looking forward to that date like a kid looking forward to Christmas. When he asked me out, I felt a little flutter in my stomach, and he seemed like a charming old-fashioned gentleman with a warm smile and a way of being that made me feel like he was really listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. So we'd met through a mutual friend, and after a few texts back and forth, he suggested that we grab dinner and take a walk on the beach. It sounded perfect, like something out of a movie. I spent a while picking out my outfit, which ended up being a simple sundress. Nothing too fancy, but nice enough to feel good about myself. And I was nervous but excited, hoping that this could be a start to something. And the evening started great. We went to this little seafood place near the shore. It was cozy with string lights and the smell of fried shrimp in the air. And we talked about everything. Movies, music, our favorite places to hang out. And he was easy to talk to, and I felt comfortable, like I could be myself. He told stories about growing up, his old dog, and some of the dumb stuff he did as a kid. I laughed a lot, and he seemed to enjoy making me smile. After dinner, we decided to walk along the beach. The sun was setting, and it was kind of painting the sky this orange and pink, and the waves were calm, lapping up at the shore. It felt romantic, like we were in our own little Disney world. We walked side by side, our shoes were off, sand cool between my toes, and I was happy, thinking that maybe this was someone I could really like. We talked about random things at first, how he liked surfing, how I'd always wanted to try it. But then, it seemed like the conversation just sort of shifted. He started talking about his family, his parents mostly, and I listened, interested in learning more about him, and that's when he said it, so casually, like it was no big deal. How sometimes his dad used to hit his mom. And my stomach dropped. I stopped walking for a second, thinking that I must have heard him wrong, but he kept going, saying that it didn't seem to hurt their relationship and that it was just how things were sometimes. Now my heart started racing, and not in a good romantic way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd grown up in a house where my parents never laid a hand on each other no matter how mad they got, so the idea that a man was hitting a woman, especially for something as small as talking back, made me feel physically sick. And I couldn't stay quiet. I told him I didn't agree, that no real man would ever hit a woman just for speaking her mind. I wasn't trying to start a fight, I just couldn't let that slide, because it felt wrong to nod along like it was okay. I thought he'd maybe explain himself or say that he didn't mean it like that, but his face changed, and his eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. I could tell he was mad, but I didn't expect what came next. Before I knew it, he was yelling about how I was insulting his dad, how I didn't know what I was talking about. I tried to stay calm, to backtrack a little, but he refused to listen to me. And then he grabbed my arm, so hard that it hurt, and I froze. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs couldn't move. He gave me a sharp slap across my face that stung and made my eyes water. I stumbled back, shocked, trying to process what was happening. This guy I'd been laughing with for an hour ago was now hitting me. He didn't stop. He grabbed me again, and I felt another blow, this time to my shoulder from a closed fist. and pain shot through me and I started to panic. I tried to push him away, but he was stronger. And I was scared, really scared, and all I could think was that I needed to get away. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe just a few seconds, maybe a whole minute, but it felt like forever. My face was throbbing and my arm hurt where he grabbed me, and I was crying and trying to shield myself when suddenly I heard shouting. Not from him, but from other people. Suddenly there were footsteps in the sand and a group of strangers appeared out of nowhere. They were yelling at him to stop, pulling him off of me. And I fell to my knees, shaking, trying to catch my breath. There were 3 or 4 of them, I think, and within seconds they were between us and keeping us separate. One of them, a woman, knelt beside me asking if I was okay, and I couldn't answer. I was too shaken up, my mind racing with what had just happened. The guy was yelling at the group, cursing and trying to push past them. I looked up and saw him struggling, his face all twisted with anger. I was terrified he'd come back for me, but the people held him back, telling him to leave. Someone mentioned calling the cops, and that's when he bolted. He ran down the beach, disappearing into the dark. And I just sat there, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of something I'd never make sense of. The woman stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, telling me that I was safe now. Another guy was on his phone, talking to the police and giving them a description of what had happened. My face hurt and I could feel a bruise forming on my arm, and I was embarrassed, scared, and angry all at once. And I kept thinking about how fast everything had changed. One minute we were having a great date, and the next he was hitting me. And I felt stupid for not seeing it coming, but for thinking he was a good guy. The woman helped me stand and I realized that I was still crying. She was kind, telling me it wasn't my fault and that I didn't do anything to deserve this. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me was blaming myself for saying anything about his dad. A couple of police officers showed up a little while later. I was sitting on a bench near the beach, wrapped in a jacket one of the strangers had given me. The officer asked me what happened and I told him everything, from the dinner to the walk to what he said about his parents. And it was hard to talk about, especially with my face still stinging and my hands were still shaking. They asked for his name, his number, and anything I knew about him, and I gave them what I could, but I didn't know much. We'd literally only just met. And they'd said they'd try to find him, but since he ran off, it might take some time, and I just remember nodding and feeling very numb. The woman who stayed with me offered to drive me home, and I didn't want to be alone, so I accepted. And on the way, I felt betrayed, not just by him, but by my own judgment. I thought that he was someone I could trust. And when I got home, I locked the doors and just sat on my couch, still sitting in my nice dress, staring at the wall. My phone was full of notifications, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Because that night changed me. I felt less trusting, more guarded, and I kept thinking about his face and how it went from warm and kind to that just cold and angry look so fast. I had bruises for days, reminders of what had happened, but more than the physical pain, it was the shock that stuck with me. I'd gone on a date hoping for something good, and instead I ended up scared and hurt. The police called a few times after that, but they never were able to get in contact with this guy, and I honestly don't know if they ever will. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never look at a first date the same way again. I was 22, just out of college, and working at a little coffee shop downtown. He'd come in a few times, always ordering the same black coffee and flashing his smile that always made my stomach jump. He was cute, tall, and had messy brown hair with this quiet confidence that really wasn't cocky. And when he finally asked me out for dinner, I said yes before I could even finish the sentence. And that Friday night, I spent way too long getting ready. Stephen picked me up at my apartment and we went to this nice little Italian place. It was perfect, it had dim lights, good pasta, and conversation that flowed like we'd known each other forever. And we talked about music, our favorite movies, and how he was saving up to travel. And after dinner, we weren't ready to call it a night. Stephen suggested hitting a club a few blocks away, and I was all in. I loved dancing, and the idea of getting loose with him sounded pretty fun. And the club was packed, the music was loud, and the lights were flashing in a way that kind of makes you feel like you're in a different world. And we danced for hours, laughing and sipping on some overpriced drinks, and I was having the time of my life, feeling free and maybe even a little reckless in the best kind of way. And that's when we came across Dan. He came right up to us on the dance floor, very charming and very full of cocky confidence. He seemed to be older, maybe in his late 30s, and he had this slicked-back hair and a smile that was probably too perfect. And he introduced himself as Dan, but everyone called him Hot Tub Dan. And I didn't think much of that weird nickname at the time. It sounded kind of quirky, like something you'd hear in a college town. And he told us he was throwing an after-party at his place and invited us to come along. A few other people around us overheard and got excited, and before I knew it, there were maybe 6 or 7 of us piling into Ubers and heading to this Hot Tub Dan's house. And I was excited. The night felt like some kind of adventure, and I wasn't ready for it to end. Steven seemed a little hesitant, but we just brushed it off. I figured he was just being overly cautious, and I was having too much fun to really overthink anything, being young and naive. Now we pull up to Hot Tub Dan's place, and my jaw dropped. It was huge. A modern 2-story house with big windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. It looked like something out of a magazine, and inside it was even more impressive. Everything was sleek and expensive looking, with a massive living room and a bar stocked with every kind of liquor, and sliding glass doors that opened to a backyard with, you guessed it, a hot tub. And the party kicked off fast. Someone cranked up the music and people started pouring some drinks. And Dan was honestly the perfect host, always making sure everyone had a drink in their hand, always smiling and really quick with his jokes. I got caught up in the energy of everything. The hot tub was obviously a big hit. People were jumping in, laughing, splashing around. I didn't get in, but I was honestly just having a blast dancing and chatting with other people. Most of them were around my age, a mix of guys and gals who'd all ended up at Dan's place after the club. And everything seemed nice and the vibe felt carefree, like we were all just chasing a good time. Steven, though, was acting very differently. He stayed close to me, but he wasn't as into it as I was. He wasn't dancing much, and he kept looking around like he was kind of sizing things up. I noticed him watching Dan a few times, but I really didn't think much of it. I was just too busy with myself, I guess. And at around 2 a.m., I was still going strong, sipping drinks and laughing with some of the girls that I met. And that's when Steven leaned in and said we should head out. I was surprised. It was late, sure, but the party was still in full swing. I told him I wanted to stay a little longer, but he was firm about it. He said he was tired and didn't feel like sticking around. I was a little annoyed, honestly, and thought that he was being a buzzkill, but he insisted, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of everything, so we called a taxi and left. And the ride home was quiet. I was still riding the high of the night, but Steven seemed distracted. He didn't say much, just kind of looked out the window. And I figured he was just tired or maybe not as into partying as I was. And when we got to my place, he walked me to my door, gave me a quick hug, and said he'd text me tomorrow. I went to bed, still buzzing from the night, thinking about everything and all the fun that I'd had. It had been such a fun and wild night, and I was already looking forward to telling my friends about it. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the police. And my stomach dropped. They asked if I'd been at a house party the night before, and I said yes, confused. They wanted me to come to the station to answer some questions, and I didn't know what was going on. But I got dressed and went, and my mind was racing the whole way there. Had something happened after we left? Was someone hurt? I had no idea, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something seriously messed up had occurred. At the station, the officers were kind but clearly serious. They sat me down and started asking about the party, stuff like when did I get there, who was I with, and what had I seen. Then and only then did they tell me why they'd called. A girl at the party had been, for lack of better words, intimately assaulted. It happened after Steven and I left in the early hours of the morning. They didn't give me too many details, but They said it was bad. Dan, the guy who owned the house, was the one who did it. My heart sank as they talked. I thought about how I'd been at that house in that hot tub backyard, laughing and dancing just hours before it happened. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, as it could have been me. They asked if I'd noticed anything off about Dan, anything that stood out. I told them that I hadn't. He seemed charming and friendly, like the kind of guy who just loved throwing parties and socializing. I mentioned how he'd been so welcoming, always making sure everyone was having a good time. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them told me they'd found a lot of evidence at Dan's house. They didn't go into further specifics, but they said he'd recorded things, videos, pictures, stuff he kept on his computer. It made me feel sick. The guy I'd thought was just a fun host was a predator, and I'd been in his house completely clueless. And I left the station feeling shaky. The whole drive home I kept thinking about how close I'd come to something awful. If I'd stayed longer, if I'd gotten in that hot tub, if I had one more drink, any of those things could have put me in danger. And I felt stupid for not seeing it, for thinking the party was just a good time. But more than that, I kept thinking about Steven. He'd been so insistent about leaving, even when I wanted to stay, and at the time I'd been annoyed, but now realized that he'd probably saved me from something horrible. I texted Steven as soon as I got home, asking if we could talk, and he came over that afternoon and I told him everything the police had said. And he looked pale, like he was just processing all of it too. I asked him why he'd been so set on leaving the party, and he said he didn't know Dan, but something about him felt off. He couldn't explain it exactly. He said it was just a gut feeling based on the way Dan was acting. He was always hovering around the girls, pushing drinks on them and making them feel uneasy. He didn't want to scare me at the time, so he just said he was tired and wanted to go. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I hugged him and thanked him. I don't know if he realized how much he'd done for me that night, so I was sure to let him know. In the weeks that followed, I kept up with the news about Dan, and it turned out his real name wasn't even Dan. It was like Chris or something, and Hot Tub Dan was just what people called him. The police found a ton of evidence on his computer, videos he'd taken of girls at his parties, some of them unaware they were even being recorded. It was disgusting. He'd been doing this for years, throwing these big parties, luring people in and then taking advantage of them. The girl from our night wasn't the first. I felt so angry, but also so helpless. I kept thinking about her, wondering if she was okay and hoping that she had people to actually support her. Dan, or Chris, eventually went to trial a few months later. I wasn't called as a witness, but I followed the case online, and the evidence was just overwhelming, especially the stuff on his hard drive. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It felt like justice, but it didn't erase what had happened, and I couldn't stop thinking about how lucky I'd been and how one decision had actually kept me safe. And after that, I saw Steven a lot. We started hanging out more, and he became someone I trusted completely. I don't know if it was the intensity of that night or just how easy it was to be around him, but we obviously grew close. And I told him one day how grateful I was for what he'd done. He just sort of shrugged and said he was glad that we left when we did. That's Steven, though. Quiet, steady, and always looking out for me. And looking back, that night was kind of just a blur of fun and danger, a mix of naive excitement and a close call I'll never forget. I still love a good night out, obviously, but I'm more careful now. I trust my instincts and the people who have good ones. That night could have changed my life in the worst possible way, but thanks to Steven, it didn't. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also now have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below if you want to check it out. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you find yourself in the cheese caves, be sure to delete my taxes. When I was a teenager, we moved into a Victorian-era terraced house in a small town in the United Kingdom. Houses in the UK can be centuries old, obviously, and even a Victorian-era house has seen its share of death and tragedy. So we moved into 18 Wyvern Terrace, town redacted as want to remain anonymous, and you could tell that the previous occupants had lived there for many years. This was the 1980s, but the most recent decor looked to be from the early 70s at that, and most of it much older. It had also been owned by an extremely old couple. They weren't always extremely old, I assume, but they were by the time we bought the house. Now anyways, the house had a pretty eerie, old kind of feeling. If you've ever lived in an old house along these lines, you'll know what I mean. There were various oddities, like how in the back guest bedroom there were what appeared to be knife gouges, only 8 feet up on the ceiling. The floors downstairs were all wooden parquet floors, with another layer of wooden floors underneath them that we discovered. And there was also a fireplace. It was all bricked up and then plastered up, and I remember me and my siblings being disappointed about this because it was pretty sad to have an ornate-looking fireplace, but it's sealed up so you can't use it. Now when I asked Dad about it, he just said that he had no idea and that it was probably just that the chimney stacks in the terraced houses had fallen into disrepair. We weren't the only house in the street who had a sealed-up fireplace either. Now fast forward 6 months, I made a couple of friends in the neighborhood. Diano and Danielle were 2 of my best pals, and my younger brother buddied around with this kid named Tom. Now we'd all hang out at the nearby park and just do what 6 to 9-year-old kids did back in the 1980s. Now one day, Danielle, or Danny, asked me if I knew the history of my house. I told her what I did know, and she said no, she didn't mean that. There was a legend about the house from back in Victorian times, and all the neighborhood kids knew about it, and it was time for me to know too. Danny wasn't usually one for pranks or kidding around, so we listened raptly as she told us about how this little chimney sweep kid had gotten stuck in the flue back in the late 1800s. And somehow nobody had realized that he was up there for a few days. Don't ask me how this was possible. Eventually, while the family were sitting in the living room, reading and listening to the gramophone or whatever Victorians did, there was a sudden thump from the fireplace and a cloud of ash. As you've guessed, the body of the urchin chimney sweep had somehow gotten dislodged from the flue and fallen down. He was emaciated, broken, and mutilated. But, as the story goes, he wasn't dead. He reached up out of the fireplace and croaked a single sentence towards the family. "I fell." And then the boy dropped dead. Now, me and my brother Chris went home after that, and we accused Danny, in a good-naturedly way, of trying to spook us, but she swore that she wasn't and just told us to be careful of the boy who fell. Now, a few nights later, I had a dream about being trapped in the chimney. I couldn't move, I was upside down somehow, and I also possessed the full knowledge that my employers, a local rag and bone organization with a side hustle in chimney sweeping, had sent me up there knowing full well that I'd get stuck and then claim that I'd abandoned the job. I didn't know why they'd done this, but that's the information I had. I'm not saying this is some kind of premonition. I've been doing a lot of reading up on chimney sweeps and orphans and urchins since Danny had told us the story of the boy who fell, so maybe it got lodged into my mind. But I'm also not willing to rule out the fact that the boy somehow reached out to me, not after what happened next. Now, for the next few nights, whenever I was watching TV with my family in the living room, I kept glancing at the plastered-over fireplace. Now, the very sight of it freaked me out, And on top of that, we'd been hit by a storm that was said to last a few days, so all kinds of ghostly whistling and howling was coming from behind the boarded-up chimney, and I hated it. But it also confused me a bit. Danny had warned me to be careful, but what was I supposed to expect? The chimney was plastered up. At worst, and even this seems pretty terrifying, I might hear the thump of an unseen body, right? Now, I managed to convince myself that if this did happen, I could just live with it. In fact, maybe he'd sense my empathy towards him and, I don't know, his spirit might be at peace or something. It was a Friday night. I was on my own because my parents were out to see my brother's school nativity play or some crap, and no way was I going to that, obviously. So Danny and Deano came over and we played Mega Drive, or as you Americans like to call it, Genesis, for a while until they both had to go home. Deano left and Danny was just standing on the doorstep saying goodbye. Now looking back, I think she had a bit of a crush on me because she is always finding excuses to stick around when it was just me and her, but I was oblivious to that. What I wasn't oblivious to, though, was asking her about the boy who fell. I explained my confusion and asked what's the worst he could do if his ghost fell down the chimney while it was plastered up. And I'll never forget Danny's words. No, the boy who fell doesn't just fall down the chimney. He can fall from anywhere. Now, I thought about the high-ceilinged Victorian house. I thought about the attic trapdoor. I thought about the other flue in the kitchen, which had also been sealed up, but higher up. I thanked Danny for explaining and closed the front door. I turned, walked over the mat well of the small entry porch that led between the front door and the inner door. The small, high-ceilinged entry porch whose ceiling was out of sight once you stepped out of the porch due to the way the wall was built. I didn't even give this layout any thought as I clicked the inner door closed and took a few steps into the empty, darkened house. And then from behind me, I heard the sound of something falling in the porch area, something about the size and weight of a small urchin boy. And then I heard the voice, a croaky, raspy, centuries-old plea for help from a young boy who died hopeless, forgotten, and unloved. I fell. And I turned, slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. If he'd fallen from the ceiling of the porch, then he'd be on the ground, out of sight behind the inner door. The inner door had a glass window as the top half of the door, so I was able to creep closer and peer in, somehow brave enough to peer over in case the boy was lying on the ground. In my dumbass mind, I thought that maybe I could assist him even though he was long dead. Now I looked through the window and down the mat well, and I saw nothing. Obviously, there was nothing there. I let out one of the biggest, most relieved breaths, turned around, and headed back into the house. And then I heard it again. I fell. And from where the voice was coming from, it wasn't the porch. And then it dawned on me. It was coming from above me. Slowly, terrified, I looked up. And there, on the ceiling, crouched spider-like, broken and emaciated, was the boy who fell. He was looking down at me with a broken neck, grinning through dirty yellow teeth. I fell, he said. Then the boy let go of the ceiling and fell straight downwards towards me. And the next thing I remember, I'm waking up in my bed. My parents were home because I could hear them going to bed themselves. And I did my best to convince myself that I've gone to bed after Danny had left and the rest had been some nightmare. I got myself worked up. Obviously, the boy who fell didn't exist. And I even managed to convince myself of this until next year. The year when Chris went missing. It was chaos around the house for weeks, and maybe that's why it took us all so long to notice the smell gradually building up in the living room. It became unbearable, and my parents' relationship was already so fraught, but Mom forced Dad to hire workers to smash their way into the chimney stack and dig out the dead bird or cat of whatever was causing the smell. They barely finished smashing the plaster when there was a loud thump and a cloud of dust. I don't know why I'd been present, but I think a part of me was expecting this. The worker who had been using the sledgehammer screamed in terror and then ran from the room. I edged closer. My brother Chris lay broken and emaciated in the bricked-off fireplace. There was never an official explanation as to how the hell he got up there. His friend Tom got the blame. Tom lived next door, and he admitted that they'd been climbing on the roof out of the skylight. And the official explanation is that Chris went out there on his own somehow and decided to climb down the decommissioned chimney. Nobody talked about the fact that there was very little chance Chris could have fit down that tube. Nobody mentioned the rumor of the boy who fell, and I most certainly did not tell anyone about my encounter with the boy that night in my dreams. All I can think is I somehow placated the boy who fell by acknowledging him, and maybe my brother Chris simply did not. All I know now is that that house is now home to 2 boys who fell, and something tells me that things won't ever end there. My wife and I recently moved into what we hoped would be our forever home, ready to have a family. Older brick houses aren't super common in the States, but you find them more in Chicago. And we got a killer deal on a really old brick house, and it was a real fixer-upper, but that was fine by us given how cheap we got it. We threw ourselves into the DIY work with enthusiasm. One of the last jobs involved knocking down a connecting wall, and this is where things got weird. One of the builders called us over to take a look at something. It was a glass jar seemingly filled with liquid, and I sort of gently removed it from the hole, but what I saw almost caused me to recoil back. The jar, a very large mason jar, contained some kind of imp or a beast. Now, a little backstory or history here. Finding jars that have been contained behind walls of bricks isn't actually that scary. Witches' jars used to be a popular superstition back in ye old times, and if you believed a witch had cursed you, then putting something like a hair or a nail or personal belongings into a jar and then containing it in your house behind bricks was supposed to protect you from the curse. It seems strange to us now, but it was a pretty harmless superstition. Unless you were genuinely cursed by a witch and the jar didn't work, I guess. An even more mundane explanation is a time capsule. There have been plenty of time capsules found embedded in the bricks and mortar of older houses and sometimes in jars. These contain everything from baseballs to old photos to locks of hair, baby pictures, keepsakes, all sorts of things. And then there's a more grim tradition. There have been records of fetuses found in jars and then contained inside those brick walls. Usually late-term miscarriages or stillbirths. The purposes of breaking them up inside the walls is pretty unknown, at least to me, and I didn't really care to look into it deeper. And the idea of burying your deceased unborn child in the wall of your house felt very dark to me. I can't imagine living in a place knowing that your deceased offspring is just a stone's throw away, buried in the darkness. And yet somehow this real darkness paled in comparison to what we found, at least at first. I actually did think that we'd stumbled upon a fetus at first glance. The jar was filled with this very cloudy liquid and covered with dust so thick it was barely possible to see what floated inside. We managed to scrub away the grime, though, taking care not to open the jar because why the flipping heck would we even do that? And inside, well, I was not expecting what I saw. The thing that floated in the jar was some kind of imp creature. A bizarre, monstrous critter, the size of a newborn baby but with an emaciated, hairy body. The head, though, that was something else entirely. It looked like a rodent, a large rat maybe, and the skin had peeled off in places, revealing almost deliberate patches of visible bone. The eyes, though, they were perfectly preserved, black and open and staring, and the lips were curled back in a sort of sneer. It looked exactly like those wooden carvings that you'd see in religious texts or in some churches, a little imp or a demon. Of course, being a modern and rational couple, my wife and I were just absolutely fascinated by this very macabre thing. There was no way we were calling a museum who might somehow forcibly take it off our hands. So we called up a buddy of ours who was the closest thing to a historical medical expert we knew. He was a vet, and he came over all like, "I'm not going to have a clue and you need to call the authorities." But after a little time examining the jar, he began to laugh. Apparently what we had on our hands was a prank. An old prank, perhaps 80 years old or more, but a prank nonetheless. It was a rat's head sewn onto a monkey's body. And when our buddy pointed this out and pointed to the stitching and the signs of taxidermy through the jar, it became pretty obvious. We'd been had, and the prank had been successful. No, I was excited to know what kind of pranksters had actually put a taxidermied rat monkey in the wall, knowing that they likely wouldn't be able to be alive to see the results of their prank. So I got pretty obsessed about trying to find the details on the owner of the property from roughly back when my buddy figured the jar was dated. The owners back then, and for many years around the time, were an elderly couple, and their story was kind of tragic. Like many young men at the time, their son had signed up to join the Allies in the war effort, and was shipped across the ocean from Oregon to France, where by all accounts he died almost immediately upon exiting onto the beach. One terrible local newspaper report I discovered, some kind of history of the area thing published long after the couple had died, reported that the son had his head blown off by a German mortar. Coupled with the rat-headed monkey, this naturally creeped me out, but in a way that was weirdly, morbidly fascinating. I don't think it was the son that actually put that rat monkey in the wall, though. The story got weirder after that. Some years after the son's death, a former soldier who'd served in the same unit showed up at the old couple's door. He claimed to be a close friend of their son, and they took him in almost suspiciously quickly and treated him as if he was their own. Grief can kind of do that, I hear, and I've heard of a number of scammers and grifters preying on the elderly parents of deceased soldiers. This doesn't seem to be what happened here, though. The young man moved in with them and lived as their son for a number of years. I found a handful of letters sent by the old woman of the house, her name was Margaret, which had for some reason been returned to the sender. A whole batch of them, and in them she talked about Randy, their surrogate son, and how helpful he'd been around the house. One thing she mentioned was his DIY and his renovations that he engaged in to keep the house running smoothly. She particularly mentioned him repairing the fire breast wall in the living room, which is where we discovered that rat monkey in the jar. And so it stood to reason that Randy, whatever his motive, had actually put the bricks up on that wall over a taxidermied rat monkey. And where had it come from? Who knew? Why did he do it? No idea. The old couple seemed to have no idea that this creepy-ass creature lurked in their walls. My wife's theory was that it had some special meaning to Randy and Franco, the deceased soldier, the couple's son. Maybe something to do with desert rats or little monkeys or God knows what. Either way, it felt weirdly wholesome, and I guess that's why we were comfortable leaving the weird display on the mantelpiece on full display for when we held our much-anticipated housewarming party. We nicknamed the rat monkey Vantus. Now, I have no idea where that name came from. My wife insists that I devised it, but I'm sure it was her. Now, regardless, Vantus became the focal point of the evening, as each of our 10 guests spent a long amount of time studying and photographing the weird little curio. Now, more than one of them suggested that we put that thing in the museum, and I remember getting kind of angry at the suggestion. Vantus was ours, and he belonged in this house. There was no question about that. One guest, who didn't suggest that we hand Vantus over to a museum, was this friend named Shahid, a good friend of ours from back in our college days. Now, this guy was obsessed with Vanta. Every time I entered the living room, he'd be standing at that mantelpiece, staring at the little beast. And he also seemed to be getting progressively more intoxicated as the night went on, which was odd as Shahid really didn't drink or party. But there was absolutely no doubt that something was clouding his mind, and it began to mess with my head, thinking that maybe it was that Vantus. I'd made it very clear to the guests that we weren't to touch that thing. We had no idea what kind of liquid or chemical filled the jar, but it was likely to be formaldehyde, which is most definitely not good for you. Plus, we didn't want drunken party guests manhandling our little guy or causing any damage. Now, we should have kept a closer eye on Shahid as the evening went on, and looking back, it was obvious that something weird was going on, but we didn't really show any concern until my wife dragged me into the living room and I was just frozen in horror as I saw Shahid holding the jar over his head. Now, this guy was muttering something like, "He wants to be out. He wants to be free," and then staring me straight in the eyes, and he threw the heavy jar down onto the stone floor. Now, at first, I thought with amazement that the jar had survived the throw, but then slowly a spiderweb of splinters spread through the glass, and all of a sudden it just sort of exploded, and a splash of the most noxious-smelling liquid I have ever experienced in my life. It was formaldehyde, all right, but there was something else mixed in with preservative, too. Sulfur, definitely, because I could smell that rotten egg smell. But there was also something sort of, as they say, sickly sweet, like dead roses or lilies. And almost immediately, the guests around us started gagging, running to the windows, trying to get air into the room, or just simply intending to leave the house. I couldn't blame them. It was almost unbearable. However, my wife just stood there, frowning, seemingly unbothered by the scent of Vantus's vile preservative, and then she rushed over to the site of the destruction. But then even more bizarre was the guy Shahid. Just after my wife reached him, he drops to his knees and was fumbling through the broken glass and formaldehyde, cutting his hands as he did so, and his blood mingling with the cloudy, stinking liquid. None of this was what caused my blood to freeze like ice in my veins, though. What terrified me the most was the fact that Vantus was gone. There was no sign of the taxidermied rat monkey. Shahid was howling that the creature had been taken and that someone wanted to hurt him. Anyone would have thought that it was his own child who disappeared, not a taxidermied imaginary creature. Shahid's baby son, who was at home with his wife, his 18-month-old baby who was said to be incredibly smart for his age, his beloved child who he called my little savant. Anyone would have thought it was his own child who disappeared, not a taxidermied imaginary creature. Shahid's baby son, who was at home with his wife, his 18-month-old baby who was said to be incredibly smart for his age, his beloved child who he called my little savant. Everyone who attended the party ended up having to go to the hospital for the exposure to the formaldehyde fumes. That crap can be lethal at the best of times, let alone under these strange circumstances. Shahid in particular had to stay in for observation. He'd been touching the fluid with open wounds and had almost certainly ingested some. The fluid was so old that even with samples, the hospital weren't able to determine exactly what had been in that jar. One thing that most certainly was no longer in the jar, though, was Vantus. The creature was just completely gone. And all throughout his hospital stay, that's all Shahid really seemed to care about. Had we found Vantus? Was that baby okay? It was nuts. We searched the house and there was no sign of this taxidermied animal. I could think of only two possibilities. One, my wife had for some reason snatched him up and stashed him away, and she flat out denied this. And the other option was that Vantus, a dead, preserved, stitched-together animal, had gotten up from his broken prison and run away. And as much as I wanted to believe the second part, I just couldn't, which meant that my wife, for some unknown reason, had sneakily taken and hidden Vantus while I was distracted dealing with that guy. It seemed pretty preposterous, but when I suggested it to her, calm as I could, she almost exploded with rage at me. It was the weirdest crap. Like this rat monkey had somehow turned the woman I loved into a bizarre, aggressive stranger. Now, I wish I could say things had died down and went back to normal, but my wife simply never forgave me for just asking if she'd touched Vantus. It was like I had accused her of murdering a child, and in the end, after a long, drawn-out process of her changing, I had no choice but to file for divorce, and it was genuinely like living with a stranger. The formaldehyde must have done something to her mind, I think, and it can do that to people, I heard. There's no way that a dead rat-monkey hybrid caused my wife to become a totally different person. And likewise, it was the formaldehyde fumes that made Shahid act so irrational. They must have been leaking out of the jar somehow, no matter how tightly it was sealed. And there was just no way that the horrifying little creature, Hidden behind the walls of our forever home was anything more than a bizarre piece of art. Chemicals and disease affect the mind. Strange little imps don't. Even if they look suspiciously like Babylonian demons found in a book. Even if, as the chump who still lives alone in that house to this day, I still sometimes hear tiny running footsteps just out of sight, and I smell the scent of that hideous formaldehyde. Even if the sudden and unexpected loss of Shahid's savant son a few months later caused the poor man to take drastic measures to escape this world of pain. And despite all of this, despite everything, I do consider myself a rational man. I simply cannot allow myself to believe that Vantus was anything more than some stuffed piece of taxidermy. I can't allow myself to believe that when I wake up at night, short of breath, the feeling that something was sitting on my chest is anything other than age getting the better of me. I can't believe that the wet, stinking footprints I see every now and then are anything more than the next door's cat. And I can't allow myself to succumb to the intrusive thought that maybe, just maybe, Vantus has brothers buried in the walls in other parts of the house who are all vying to be free. I can't believe this, but the chisel and sledgehammer I have sitting in the kitchen look more and more tempting every day. Talk me out of it, guys. Tell me to move. Tell me I'm being a madman, because the alternative is far too insane to comprehend. The couple that wandered through the Midwest like a storm no one saw coming, leaving towns shaken and families afraid at night. Their partnership seemed fueled by something cold and relentless, as if every step drew them deeper into a darkness only they understood. To this day, whispers linger about the pair who moved from place to place with unsettling purpose, two shadows bound together by fear, chaos, and a trail of unanswered questions. Listen to the full story of the Midwest Butchers over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. I never thought to Google what this is until discussing it with my wife today, and strongly believe that we had a mimic growing up. Reading some of your accounts of very similar events brought me to actual tears, and I've told these stories to people throughout my life and have never forgotten it. It presented itself several times in the house over the course of many years, twice in very similar ways, and stopped after the final one. And when I was very young, probably 6 or so, I woke up late at night to see my mom cross by my door. My parents' bedroom and mine were next to one another at the time, with a bathroom across the hall. It was very specifically my mom, and she had a specific nightgown on. I called out to her, and it arched its back and contorted itself in a way that I can only describe as like when a cat does it. I put my head back down and covered my head, and when I looked again, she was gone. Now fast forward a few years to maybe middle school. I'm downstairs alone and the power goes out in the middle of the day. The house was a bit older and had ratty drop ceilings in the basement, so whenever I was down there I could usually tell where everyone in my family was. A second after, the power goes out. I hear a solid minute of what sounded like very heavy boots stomping around upstairs, and thuds and rattling as if things in the house were being dragged and thrown around. After it stopped and I eventually went upstairs, there wasn't a thing out of place. Now the third physical event was another few years later, near the end of high school. I sometimes would doze off on the couch in the basement on the weekends, staying up too late. I woke up, looked over the back of the couch, and what looked like my dad was sitting at my family computer. The lights were off downstairs, but I could see him in the glow of the monitor. This was pretty unusual, as my dad was not really a night owl, and I called out to him, and the same thing as the first time happened, as I can only describe it as bristling and changing its posture to be deeply hostile looking without turning to look at me. I put my head back down for a second to compose myself and try to get a grip and make sure that I wasn't just freaking myself out or making absolutely sure that I was awake, and I got back up and was gone. Now, I was not sleeping. I stood up and went upstairs after that and was up for a while. And the last thing, After a few years ahead, when I was a part way through college, I got home pretty late and the hallway near my bedroom was unnaturally, weirdly cold in one area, much more so than the rest of the house. Now I knew full on something was strange, but tried to put it out of my mind and force myself to be rational. I got in bed and felt someone sit on the edge of the bed on the side away from where I was facing. Totally frozen in shock at this point, it put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Hey, wake up." In what sounded like my dad's voice, who was pretty soft-spoken and not threatening sounding at all. Mind you, I was not asleep at all, and I shot up at this point and nobody was there. The last occurrence felt sort of final in a weird way that I can't exactly explain. And I lived there full-time for another couple of years until I finished college, visited for days at a time often, and then full-time another 6 months a few years later when changing careers and moving back home from an out-of-state job. Not a hair out of place in the house ever again, and I never told my parents about it, but I just wanted to share with you guys, having spent some time tonight reading other people's stories and realizing that I wasn't alone in this kind of specific phenomenon. Why it presented itself in such a frightening way but spoke so gently, I have no idea. It freaks me out talking about it to this day. When I was a kid, so about 8 or so, I was kind of a weeby crybaby. I got bullied a lot and I didn't handle it well, and I'm very, very different now, partly because of how often I was the target of needless bullying. There wasn't anything about me that the bullies especially focused on, though. I was just a bit short, a bit skinny, and didn't have to try too hard to make me cry. I wasn't popular either. I just had maybe 2 mates, and their names were Neil and Sammy, and neither of them really hung around with me at school because I was kind of a loser. I don't blame them, and they've since apologized for not having my back as much as they should have. Now one day, after a routine eye test, I found out that I needed glasses, and you can imagine the absolute terror that I felt. Finally, the bullies would have an actual reason to pick on me, and something they could actually break. And so Mum forced me to get the glasses, and I promptly put them in my desk drawer and vowed never to wear them ever again, no matter what. Now this was a while ago, so whatever. Glasses weren't cool back then, and these days I think I rock a neat set of frames like a boss, but that's not the point. The point was that my eyesight just wasn't great. I somehow got it into my head that if I looked out my bedroom window at night and studied the roofs of the town and tried to pick out details as far away as I could somehow train my eyes to get better so I wouldn't need to get glasses anymore. I don't know. At the time it made sense in my head. So basically I spent around 10 minutes every night staring out my window. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and focusing on different signs in stores and trying to condition my eyes into reading them properly. Now I think it kind of worked even, to some weird degree. And after a few days of doing this, I noticed something weird. Well, more than weird actually. It was bloody terrifying. There was a ghostly head floating above the house of a neighbor one street over. Just this guy, vaguely spectral, floating above the roof. I have no idea how to respond to it or what to do or what to say. I tried to ignore him for the next few days, but he was always there, floating just above a shiny patch on the roof. My eyesight was bad, so I couldn't make out much about his features, just that it was definitely a human head and shoulders, seemingly hovering just over the roof. When I looked in the daytime, he wasn't there, and to my 8-year-old mind, this made complete sense. Ghosts don't appear in the daytime. But I'd uncover a mystery worthy of the Scooby-Doo gang, which I still watch religiously, and maybe this is why I was bullied as a kid. Now, I wasn't scared of the ghost exactly, just sort of unsettled by the fact that he simply was floating there, looking at something. It was a 2-story house, so my house was a fair bit taller, so I was just looking down at this house and the ghost. Now one day, my mate Neil came over after school, and I braved the potential risk of being a social pariah to tell him that I'd been seeing a ghost floating over a house. Neil didn't laugh at me like I expected, but instead he asked me to show him which house. I explained that we wouldn't be able to see him because it was still daylight, but I pointed at the house and Neil reminded me that it was his street, and I could even see his roof a few houses down. He asked me about the ghost, and I described him as best I could. He looked like a guy with brown hair, and he was always wearing a mustard-colored sweater from what I could tell. Neil frowned and said this sounded like the guy who lived in that house, and now that he thought about it, he hadn't seen that fella for some time now. Now, sunset was about 8 p.m., and Neil was meant to go home earlier than that, but we managed to finagle things with my mom and Neil's parents so he could stay for tea and a sleepover because it was a Friday night. We kind of got distracted playing Atari, and it wasn't until it had gone 9 that Neil was suddenly like, "Crap, the ghost." So we looked out the window, and sure enough, there it was, floating just above the shiny bit of the roof. Now Neil looked at me, his face completely pale, and the first thing he said was, "You need glasses." And that's when I admitted that I did have glasses, but I hadn't been wearing them because I was afraid of being bullied. And then Neil says, "Not at all? Not even on your own?" And I felt kind of stupid because no, I'd refused. He told me to get the damn glasses out and put them on. And a part of me was worried that he was about to laugh at me for what I was going to see. But then I could see his hands trembling, and he genuinely wanted me to see something. Reluctantly, I retrieved the glasses from the drawer and put them on, and spent a few minutes adjusting to the fact that, holy crap, I could actually see properly now. What was wrong with me? Why had I resisted this for so long? And then Neil guided me to look out the window. The shiny part of the roof was the skylight, and the screen light hit the glass in a sort of specific way. And this meant that to someone with poor eyesight, anything positioned under the skylight kind of looked like it was projected into the air somewhat. And it's hard to describe, and to this day I'm not 100% convinced that it makes sense with how light or reflections even work. So Neil pointed out that what I was seeing was the reflection of a face in the skylight, and the reflection was only visible at night because of the way the streetlight caught the glass at an angle. I don't know, that was his explanation anyway, and it made it look like this guy's face was sort of floating ghostly above his roof. Now I'm thinking, okay, damn, what a fool I was being freaked out by that. But then Neil says, "No, don't you understand? Why would my neighbor's face be facing upwards at the skylight all night every single night? And I haven't seen the bloke around the neighborhood for a couple of weeks. He was always out there mowing his lawn." Now Neil had assumed that he was on holiday or something, but we got it into our heads reasonably and accurately that he was lying face up under the skylight and I'd somehow been seeing him. And if someone's lying face up all night every night, and probably all day too, well, that kind of suggests something had caused them to be doing that, right? Neil managed to persuade his parents that he thought that something was up, explained that we'd seen this guy lying there from my bedroom window. They knocked on him with no answer and called on him. And they came over to my house after dark, and Neil's parents and mine stared in horror as they could see the odd reflection of this guy. I explained to them how he looked like a floating ghost with my glasses off, worried sick that they'd be mad at me for not telling anyone sooner. And instead, they all seemed worried about me for having to see what I saw, because it turned out that what I saw was the dead body of a man who dropped dead of a brain aneurysm. He had no family and kept to himself, and if I hadn't seen him from my window and thought that he was a ghost, then he might have been up in what turned out to be his office, dead and alone, until he'd fully decomposed. I wasn't able to save him, but I was able to save him from the indignity of decomposing alone. And when word got out, people started to question how nice of a guy like that could just sort of die alone and unloved. And it brought the community together briefly. His funeral had an incredible turnout, and I attended, and it was my first ever funeral, in fact. And so this is a ghost story that wasn't a ghost story and had a perfectly rational explanation, but the request wasn't to submit non-ghost stories, was it? So here's the actual final twist. And so after his funeral, after his death had an undeniable impact on me, I found myself looking out across the town at night again for the first time in weeks. I wore my glasses now, which I had been wearing religiously ever since, and then I did a double take when I saw a hazy shape floating across the skylight, exactly where I'd originally seen the reflection of the neighbor's corpse. This time, he was definitely floating above the roof, and he was definitely looking right at me. And to this day, I would swear that even from this distance, I saw him give me almost a smile and a nod. And then inexplicably the streetlight went out, like the bulb itself blew, and his house was cast into darkness. I never mentioned this last part to anyone until now, telling you, but I know what happened. The lonely, bullied boy who'd probably had more in common with the overlooked man who died alone received one final thank you from the guy. A guy who, by pure chance, I'd finally managed to give the attention and love he deserved. So to preface, I am a priest of a small-town parish. I do a lot of priestly things that I won't bore you about, but perhaps one of my least favorite jobs for obvious reasons is having to take funerals. The reasons being because it means someone's died, obviously, and the people I come in contact with around funerals are typically extremely sad and obviously distressed. And that's why when I pulled up into the driveway of 58 Made-Up Lane, I'll keep things anonymous here, and walked stoically down the garden path, I was a little surprised to be greeted by a beaming young man who looked to be in his mid-30s. He shook my hand, invited me in, and told me he'd been expecting me, much as it usually goes. And when I go for a visit to plan a funeral, I don't necessarily know who I'm going to be meeting. The deceased was a man in his 70s, and my point of contact was his widow, but there's usually a good 5 or 6 family members involved in the funeral planning, and it's often one of those who hosts the meeting, invites me in, etc. So there was nothing unusual to me that my host wasn't an old lady in her 70s. And when I stepped into the hallway, which had a kind of musty, stale smell, I noticed a number of pairs of shoes lined up against the wall. I asked my host if he wanted me to remove my shoes, and he said no, it was fine. But I felt like he was simply being polite. He was extremely nice, constantly smiling and friendly, so I removed my shoes, something that always makes me a bit uncomfortable in a stranger's house, but it seemed polite in this instance. As my host led me down the hallway to the living room, I noticed how incredibly dusty the hallway was. It seemed totally at odds with this very clean, respectable young man. And the living room wasn't much better. My host offered me a seat on the couch, and as I sat down, a cloud of dust sort of billowed up that had me coughing politely into my handkerchief. If my host noticed, he didn't let on, but instead he continued smiling, asking how my week had been, asking about my health, and a bunch of just very polite and friendly chatter. Now, the living room had a huge cabinet in it, containing all kinds of strange knickknacks and china, like the kind that your old Meemaw might own. Now, it made me think that maybe this was the house of the deceased, but nobody else seemed to be around just yet, so I wasn't sure who this guy was. A grandson, maybe. Now, the family weren't parishioners, so all I had to go on were my notes from the funeral directors, and I'd left them in my car. Now, I sat on the dusty couch for what felt like about 10 minutes, chatting away with this extremely cheerful yet seemingly bereaved man about a ton of different things. And the funny thing was, I can't remember a thing of what we spoke about. The single cedar chair the man sat on seemed to be as dusty as the couch, and the whole place was in disarray. I remember noticing he was wearing what looked like an old man's cardigan and brown chinos, and it was pretty dated for a fellow of his age. Now, we were sitting chatting about who knows what when suddenly my host sprang up in another billowing cloud of dust from the seat and declared in absolute horror that he hadn't offered me a drink yet. He asked if I'd like a cup of tea, like a quaint Englishman, and of course, as a polite priest, I accepted. Now, my host scurried into the kitchen, and I was left just sort of sitting there twiddling my thumbs in the living room as I heard the kettle boiling. It was clearly one of those old-school ones that you heated up on the stove, as I could hear the slow build-up of whistling. And while I waited, I looked around the room. The photos on the wall were so dusty that I couldn't make out any details whatsoever, and I was too polite to stand up and go examine them in case my host returned and caught me snooping. And so I just sat there, perched on the edge of the couch so as not to get too much dust on my suit. Now in the kitchen, the kettle reached a boiling point and whistled and whistled and whistled. It was like the receptacle hadn't been removed from the hob, and it went on whistling for so long that it started to tickle my brain in that unpleasant way a nasty sound does. And then it struck me. Why had it been left to boil for so long? Minutes had passed. The water in the kettle would be evaporating by now, and maybe I should go and check on my host. And so I stood up and entered the kitchen, and the first thing I did was turn off the stove. And then I looked around. There was no sign of the cheerful guy. The back door was shut, and the only room leading out of the kitchen led into a pantry. No hidden exits. I checked the back door. Locked, and from the dust on the door, it hadn't been opened for quite some time. The only place he could be was under the kitchen table. Irrationally, my heartbeat began to rapidly increase as I slowly crouched down, certain that I was about to come face to face with a smiling, anachronistic man for reasons I have no idea of. And I let out a sigh of relief as under the tablecloth there was nothing at all except more thick layers of dust. So where the heck had my host gone? The only way he could have left was to come back through the living room. But what was I missing? Maybe he'd opened a window and fled, or somehow opened the back door, but why? I went back into the hallway and called upstairs, and no reply. I put one foot on the bottom step, and something, maybe the Lord himself, told me not to take another step. And when I heard that voice, I listened. Instead, I turned to retrieve the shoes I removed upon entering the house. Where rows of shoes had sat previously as if to suggest a group of bereaved family members waiting for my arrival, they were just my shoes. And feeling weirdly vulnerable, I slipped them back on and left the house, calling out goodbye just in case, and then hurried down the path to my car. Now once inside, I checked the notebook and couldn't believe my eyes. The address that I was supposed to attend for the bereavement visit was a totally different place, a good 15 minutes away. How had I ended up here, and where had I gotten this address from? Who was the guy who let me in? Now that I thought of it, he'd never once mentioned anything about bereavement or losing a loved one. He just sort of accepted the presence of a priest as if he were expecting me, but we hadn't actually discussed funeral arrangements. I called the family on my cell and apologized for being late. I made up some excuse about roadworks and a parishioner emergency. When I got there, the house I was meeting the bereaved at belonged to the widow's son. It was a normal, modern house, nothing remarkable at all about it, and the widow was a lovely lady in her 70s who explained that she'd been living with her son ever since her husband passed away a few weeks ago. It had taken a while to organize the funeral due to the red tape that can sometimes occur depending on how someone dies. I was sitting there planning out the service with them when something caught my eye. A photograph on the mantelpiece of the window, and presumably her husband. He was wearing the exact same clothes as the man that I'd met at the other address. Coincidence, though. It had to be. But then we got to the part of the funeral planning where we laid out a tribute board of photographs of the deceased. There was no questioning it, and some of the older photos showing the man in his mid-30s, he was absolutely the spitting image of the man that I'd met in the other house. Obviously, I didn't say anything to the widow or her family, but I casually asked where they used to live, using some excuse I forget now, though. And I think you can already guess. The house I'd accidentally shown up at was their former home. I guess it's possible that somewhere in my funeral notes the address had been included, but I could never locate them if so. I had no explanation how or why I'd been sent there. The only clue that I had was at the end of our meeting. I'd managed to keep it together, staying as professional as possible and not wanting to tell a grieving family that I was sure that I'd encountered the ghost of their deceased loved one. As I was leaving, though, the widow said something like this to me. "I wish Harold could have met you in life. Towards the end, he was delirious, but he kept telling us that he needed to speak to a priest. We never did find out why, but I think he would have been at ease with you." And I never did find out why either. During our meeting, if it happened at all, Harold certainly never gave any indication of what he might have needed to get off his chest to a priest. But whatever it was, I hope it allowed him to pass on to the next life having made his peace with God. I heard they're demolishing his old house to make way for a new development soon. I hope and pray that whatever Harold wanted to confess was something minor and they don't find any skeletons buried in the foundations of that house. But something tells me there's more to this story than I'll maybe ever know. So a few months ago, me and my 3 buds went out for our regular hunting and camping trip. And there was me, my friend Grant, Emilio, and Benny. Now, Benny almost didn't attend that time because his wife was pregnant and she was due to pop in probably a month, but a bit of peer pressure got him out with the boys, as I'm sure he needed it. Now we headed to our usual spot, which I'm just going to keep secret because I don't want any of y'all preying on our rich pickings out there, nor do I want y'all being potentially torn apart, which will make sense later. Now the first night, as usual, we set up the camp and just scouted the area a bit, dicked around and cooked over the campfire. There was no phone reception at our hunting spot, and we kept having to reassure Benny that his wife wasn't going to go into labor weeks early and he could just chill. Finally, we convinced him and we settled down to have the usual time of our lives. Now, filled with hamburgers, hot dogs, and beer, we all retired to our tents, ready for an early start to the next morning. We had 2 tents. I shared with Benny, and Grant and Emilio shared the other. And at just past midnight, something woke me up. Benny was sitting upright, and I asked him what was up, and he told me to shh. So I listened. And the silence was split by a howl, and then another joined, and then another, until there was this whole chorus of howling. Wolves? In this area? Now, I suggested this to Benny, and almost defensively he said no way. It must be something else. I reached for my rifle, ready to assemble it, but Benny almost urgently stopped me. Just listen, he said. And this cacophony of howling happened again. It sounded like whatever the creatures were, they were circling the campsite, and that's when I heard Emilio and Grant come stumbling out of their tent, yelling for us. Benny looked white and pale in the light of the camping lamp, and said that we had to go out there and tell them to shut the F up. And I guess that's exactly what we did. Whatever was making the howling, we did not want to attract their attention no matter how well armed we were. But here was the thing. There was absolutely nothing in sight. No creatures, no signs of creatures, not even a smell of creatures. And the howling sounded a little further away, and now that we were outside, and Benny was right. It didn't sound like wolves. They almost sounded like people doing incredibly good wolf impressions. And you know when Ozzy does his sort of bark at the moon? It genuinely reminded me of that. And suddenly Benny was hissing at us that we had to go. Just leave as much of our crap as we could risk, bring the valuables, and get in the car. Now we were baffled, but Benny wasn't the type of guy to mess around. He was a big, burly, tattooed biker type, and I'm not sure how he fell in with a bunch of nerds like us. He could have easily led a Hells Angels chapter if he wanted to. But no, he was a lovable geek like the rest of us, just a very serious one. So if Benny said that we had to hightail it out of there, then we sure as hell were going to listen. Now Benny drove in silence, and I think he broke the speed limit 3 times over, and without explanation, he headed straight to his place and bust in the front door. We followed, only to find Benny's wife passed out on the couch. Her water had broken, the phone beeping as she tried and failed to call anyone. Benny snatched her up, brought her back to the Jeep, and the 4 of us rushed his heavily pregnant wife to the hospital. It turns out his wife had gone into early labor, and there were complications with the pregnancy. Now, one of those situations was the umbilical cord getting wrapped around the baby's neck, and somehow she'd known something was wrong and had tried to call her sister, but she'd passed out on the couch. If we hadn't returned to Benny's when we had, then his wife and his beautiful newborn son may not have survived. To this day, we don't talk about the howling or the circumstances that led us to saving Benny's wife and kid. And when Benny isn't around, one of us might make a half-hearted joke about how Benny might make another friendship group other than us, a pack, if you will. We don't linger on that joke. Mostly because deep down, I don't think any of us are convinced that it is a joke. I never really believed in that kind of thing, but I would swear blind that the day that a group of unseen creatures somehow guided us to save Benny's family, and that Benny knew exactly what was going on. I can't say I'd encourage you to go out into a werewolf's hunting grounds, but if that's what we encountered, the pack protected their own to that degree, and hell, maybe Hollywood's been a bit harsh on them, and maybe being a werewolf ain't too bad at all. So this happened back in the 80s, and try as I might, I can't find anything on Google about this cryptid or creature or legend, or whatever it was still existing these days. So back in my high school years, it was a well-known fact that in the town over, Folsom, there lived this weird and bizarre creature that was called the Folsom Frog Dog. Now, the people of Folsom were smart enough to leave this swamp dweller the hell alone. It didn't harass no one, and if no one harassed it, they could just live in harmony. It's sort of like Bigfoot, you know? But us idiots were from the next town over. You know, the slightly more affluent, slightly more educated, slightly more arrogant neighboring town who sees the neighboring small town as sort of inbred yokels. Absolutely every big town has a nearby smaller town where they definitely screw their cousins, their sheep, and their mamas in that order of availability. No, I'm just kidding, but anyways, Folsom, it wasn't really Folsom, I'm just hiding the identity, was that town for us, which meant that we were determined to be the ones to go around those ways and capture the Folsom Frog Dog. Now imagine if we could get a Polaroid of that thing, or better yet, shoot it and display its corpse. Now, as you can probably imagine, the Frog Dog was rumored to be a dog that looked almost like a frog, or possibly a frog that had the characteristics of a dog. Nobody really knew for sure, and that was part of the mystique. What the hell would a frog dog look like anyway? We sure as heck wanted to find out. So, my buddies Earl and his buddies Plod and Gimbal and myself, yeah, I don't really know either when it comes to those names, so we managed to borrow a camera from the school's AV club and somehow lying our way through claims of an important project. Earl had a Polaroid, and you can sure as hell bet that all of us were able to get our hands on some shotguns. Now, we drove out to Folsom's countryside in Earl's truck, and then we went about stalking through the most foul and disgusting swampland you ever did see, and the stench was abominable. So this frog dog had to have no sense of smell if he actually lived there, or maybe he was just used to it. We spent about an hour screwing around, knocking back a few beers, but not Earl as he was driving, and generally making way too much noise for anyone trying to capture an elusive cryptid. I guess that's why we weren't prepared when the goddamn frog dog himself came bursting out of the undergrowth. At least, that's what we assume it was anyway. I don't know how I managed to study it in the brief moments before we began fleeing for our lives, but I did manage to get a good idea of what I thought the frog dog was. So it wasn't a frog or a dog. It was a hog, but one that was suffering from various mutations and skin diseases, it seemed like. It did definitely look like a frog with the build of a dog, and I kind of get that, but more accurately, it looked like a frog with the build of a feral hog, which is exactly what I thought it was. A cancerous, tragic boar covered in blisters and boils, with a condition that had caused it to lose the majority of its hair on its front half and stained its skin this really disgusting green. Let me tell you, discovering that a cryptid is actually just a diseased feral hog is not very reassuring, because those things can still F you up something real bad. And so we all screamed at each other to turn and run. Now, none of us thought to actually try shooting the thing. No, a single miss would have ended up with a goring unlike any other. And with whatever mutant diseases this thing was suffering from, we were not prepared to get close. Eventually, we managed to get back to the truck, and the frog dog was hot on our heels, and we jumped in. Before Earl gunned the engine, though, I told him to wait. The frog dog was sort of just standing there, looking at us. Its pitiful, deformed look seemed almost sad, and then it just began to wander around the clearing in full view of us, like it was disappointed that we hadn't stopped to play with it or something. And holy crap, I felt myself feeling bad for this diseased pig. Instead, what I did was grab the camera that we'd made so much effort to swipe from school and managed to get a number of actually fairly good photos of the frog dog. At one point, I could have sworn that the damn thing posed for the camera, in the way that a pet dog or almost a hamster might do. Now, my friend suggested that we shoot it while its defenses were down, and myself, Earl, and Gimbal basically threatened to kick the living poop out of him, his children, and his children's children if he harmed a hair on that poor suffering beast's head. And so instead, we just gently reversed the truck away, drove back to town, and told people that there was no frog dog and it was all just a load of crap. Let that thing live in peace, I said. Now really, we haven't even gotten to the creepy part yet, though. And so the next week, Earl and I developed the photos in the school lab, and we didn't want anyone else seeing them, even Plod and Gimbal. But we did feel like we had to do something. Whatever had mutated that poor feral hog, it probably wasn't very good for the environment. Maybe there was something in the Folsom swamps that shouldn't be there. Nuclear waste dumping or something like that. And so we made copies of the photos that clearly showed the frog dog, and we sent them off to a local wildlife protection agency. Now, a couple of weeks later, I got a call. The man on the end of the phone sounded pretty stern, and he said that he'd appreciate it if we wouldn't waste the agency's time with admittedly very creative fakes like that. But there was something about his tone, some sort of tremor in his voice that I could see through. He was hoping that I'd roll over, but he knew that they weren't fakes, and I knew that he knew. Now, I told him not to BS me, that there was no way that we could have faked those photographs. Something was going on in Folsom Swamp and it needed looking into. I mentioned the CDC, and suddenly this guy started panicking and put me onto a supervisor. The supervisor basically pleaded with me to let it drop. He told me that he would admit that what we saw was not a diseased hog, but it would be better for everyone involved if we destroyed the negatives and any copies that we had and just simply moved on with our lives. Now screw that, I thought, and despite reassuring the guy that I would actually do that, my next stop was to call Earl, as he held on to the negatives and the originals. And so I drove over to his place, all fired up, and Earl met me at the door, and when he wouldn't look me in the eye, I could tell something had happened. He told me he didn't have the negatives or the originals, that he'd misplaced them. Now I called bullcrap. Then he just took me by the shoulders and said, "Bro, let this one go. You don't know how I've covered for you here. Just let this one go." And I saw how serious he was, so what choice did I have? But it drives me insane, even decades later. The frog dog clearly wasn't just some cryptid, because why would environmental agencies even care? But why did that guy tell me that it wasn't a boar, as if that might help me piece things together? I just never worked that out. Was it some simple case of corporate corruption and toxic dumping causing an animal to sort of get sick and maybe even mutate? I don't think so. I believe that whatever created that creature we saw, that cause was natural, and that was kind of the terrifying discovery that multiple government agencies were so focused to hide, it seemed. I just wish that I knew what it was. I'm a Portuguese woman in her 20s, and I often see your viewers laughing at us foreigners who open our stories with apologies for my poor English, and then go on to write perfectly, so I'm just going to say that I'm absolutely flawless at English, and there won't be a single mistake in this entire story. Oh yeah, also I probably killed a guy. Now, in fairness, it was an accident, and I don't feel very bad about it because there was absolutely nothing that I could have done to avoid it, and also, I was 13 at the time. But it's a shocking way to start a story, isn't it? Anyways, my name is Raquel, and one time when I was a kid, I actually murdered the crap out of an old guy. Okay, that's not really what happened, but let me explain. In our local area in Portugal, there's this urban legend where you light 16 candles. I'm pretty sure whoever made this up just got that from the movie of the same name. Then you position a black mirror in the center of the circle of candles and take turns to chant details of your perfect man, i.e. the man you're trying to manifest with that ritual. Thinking about it, it's a stupid thing for a 13-year-old girl and her friends to do, because if we'd actually manifested our perfect man, then he'd also be a pretty bad person if he actually got involved with us, but I guess we really didn't think about that. Now anyways, I won't bore you with the kind of juvenile crap that 5 13-year-old girls wanted in a perfect man. And I'm sure you can imagine, especially during the era when Justin Bieber had just turned 18. The point is, the ritual did not work, and our sexy perfect Justin Bieber homunculus did not manifest in the bathroom of my friend Maria's house. So we sort of just left the candles burning and went out into the courtyard where the swimming pool was, and we went to go buy snacks from the apartment complex vending machines. Now, while we were arguing over what junk food to buy, my friend, who goes by Nora, nudges me and points over to a distant corner. There's a man standing there, dressed in all black, and it seems like he's sort of watching us. Now we begin giggling, saying that maybe we did summon our Justin, and we were all about to find true love. None of us even considered the logistics of 1 guy and 5 girls, but hey, we were as dumb as rocks. Now Maria and I were brave enough to start towards this man in black, and as he started walking towards us, too fast to be comfortable, in fact, it put us a little on defensive as my body braced for a bit of a fight. Now the guy's black hood fell back and we could see now that he was some insanely shriveled old man with a filthy beard and some disgusting beady eyes. He was liver spotted on his skin and an awkward and shuffling gait as he ran towards us. Now maybe this is just me remembering it like this due to what followed, but it felt like he wasn't used to his body, if that makes sense. Like he didn't know how to move with his old arthritic joints. He began screaming at us and pointing, shouting at us that we'd stolen his life force and we needed to give it back. Maria, who was a bit braver than me, began yelling back that we hadn't done that and he was just some weird creep who shouldn't be harassing 13-year-old girls. Now he responded with the weirdest thing. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he implied that we couldn't play the age card, not with him. I didn't know what he meant by that at the time, but I had a horrible feeling that I do now. So then the old man lunges at us, and we call the others to come help, but we decided to run away from him instead. Probably sensible, even though he's stumbling and tripping and seems like he can barely see the more he followed us through that apartment courtyard. Now we darted back into Maria's house, and then we could hear what was a series of knocks on the front door. And they didn't stop. 10, 20, 30 minutes had passed, and he was banging and banging, and we were too scared to call the cops because some of us weren't supposed to be at Maria's without an adult present. Instead, Dora suggested, what if this really was the man that we'd summoned with the ritual? Maria said that it couldn't hurt to work from this theory, so we went into the bathroom and blew out the 16 candles. And immediately, the knocking stopped. We gave it a few minutes and then looked through the peephole. No creepy old man. Maria, the brave one, opened the door a crack and looked out. No sign of him at all. And so it really had been some manifestation, we thought. We'd done magic, and proven that doing magic isn't always a great idea. And we talked about this for a while like it was the most profound thing in the world, and then we just got kind of bored of it. We watched a movie and passed out in the living room until Maria's mom woke us up the next morning. She said there were going to be cops out in the courtyard for a while, so those of us who needed to go home might want to hang around for a little longer. Maria, the curious little brat, said with love, immediately ran to the front door and rushed outside, and I followed her. Now sure enough, there were paramedics and cops, and they were fishing a body out of the pool. We watched in horror as they pulled this black-clad figure from the water. Our eyes gaped as they turned him over, and we recognized him as the man from the night before. But I swear to you, and I swear, the old man who chased us had looked to be in his late 60s and early 70s, and now he looked like he could have passed his 100th birthday. We even heard the cops talking about this while also mentioning that they'd been unable to get an ID on the guy at all, and for all I know, they never did. Now, I don't know if it was a coincidence or we somehow summoned a homunculus whose spirit and soul was drained for some purpose, but I will add this. Present day, 12 years later, every single girl present that day is in a long-term relationship with a partner we would all describe as perfect. Maria's partner is a woman even, and my husband is like the perfect man, and maybe we all just got really lucky. Or maybe we summoned some poor guy into existence whose life force was stripped and drained to somehow ensure that the 5 of us really did meet our ideal partners. Now I know this makes me sound selfish, but if I knew the truth, I'm not sure that I would have done things differently anyway. I lived in a haunted house as a kid in the 1990s, and the activity was centered around my attic loft. There were lots of unexplained noises, objects being thrown around, etc., and there was only one event in particular that truly scared me. I could have been seriously hurt if the timing had been slightly different. Now, for context, the house was built in the 1940s and it was pretty creepy, the cavernous basement and the surrounding property included, but the focus here is on the attic. The house was a traditional New England colonial with a detached two-car garage off to the side. It sat on about an acre, with 3 sides bordered by a row of evergreens and an old stone wall. The attic was a walk-up with a full set of stairs, which split it into left and right finished sections. Now, I'm talking late 1970s puke green shag carpet and wood-paneled walls. A lot of the house had been renovated around that time in the 70s or early 80s. There were 2 panels, one at the top landing and another directly above the door at the base of the stairs behind you. These were removable wall panels that led into the slope part of the house's roofline, and those compartments were used as storage crawl spaces by my father. The left side of the stairs had a waist-height retaining wall/shelf, while the right side had a full-sized wall with a small closet accessible from the opposite side. Inside that closet was another small removable access panel for something or other, and I can't remember what it was for. I honestly forgot it was even there most of the time, but this is foreshadowing. Now anyways, my dad used the left half of the attic for his collectibles and storage, while I had free reign of the right half as my hangout spot once I got into middle school at around 1997-ish. And I spent a lot of time up there playing video games and building Legos. I had 2 chairs, a couch, a table, and I could pick up a basic over-the-air TV signal. And I hung out with a bunch of my friends up there, and it was great. Now, most of the time. Now, a quick tangent, I can recall one instance when I was probably about 5 years old, really young in any event, and my dad was going into the storage space at the stair landing to shuffle around some of his collectibles, a lot of baseball-related items, but I'm getting off topic. I crawled in there and started exploring to the right side, thinking that he was messing around on the left. And in the very corner of the attic crawl space, I saw these 2 incredibly intense, ice blue glowing eyes. I got this overwhelming, unexplainable feeling of fear unlike anything else, and I just turned around and booked it out of there without saying anything. And that was the only time anything like that happened while I lived there, and I'd gone into the crawl space a ton over the years. Now that the attic layout is covered, the important parts for these occurrences are the 3 removable wall panels. These things weren't just loosely put in place. They required deliberate effort to remove. I think you know where I'm going with this. And often while I'm hanging out up there, at least the panel at the top landing would pop out of its place with enough force to slide down the stairs and crash into the door at the bottom. The panels were about 3 feet tall, and there were at least that much distance between the last step and the wall. If it was the panel above the door, on the other hand, that required even less to make a ruckus. And there was only about an 8 to 10 inch ledge next to the wall on the right that you had to shimmy across to access that panel, and I remember it being about the width of a VHS tape. Naturally, when that panel came off the wall, it crashed down 10 plus feet to the base of the stairs, making a ton of noise. Now, this was the normal version of events, and it started happening more and more the longer I'd spent time up there, from 6th through 8th grade. Typically, I'd just pick up whichever panel had fallen, put it back in place, and continue whatever I was doing. And now we're getting to the meat of the story. I was sitting in my chair playing PS1 during a long gaming sesh one summer afternoon, probably in 8th grade, and the chair was positioned a few feet from the closet directly to my left. I got up to use the bathroom on the 2nd floor, since obviously the attic didn't have any plumbing, and as I made my way towards the stairs, only a couple of feet from the chair, both the panels in the stairway suddenly flew off the walls simultaneously and collided in midair, crashing down into the stairs and the door below. On top of that, the panel inside the closet shot off the wall with the same intensity, if not greater, directly into the chair that I had been sitting in. I ran down the stairs, scared out of my mind, and didn't go back up there for hours. Aside from going back there later that day to turn off the TV and PlayStation, I don't think I went back up there again for about a week. And to put it into perspective, imagine these panels leaving the walls with roughly the same force as vehicle airbags deploying, the first generation ones, not the modern stuff that isn't quite as powerful. These were 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch thick wood panels, old school material, not the cheap stuff that you get at the store today. Getting hit by one of those would have seriously messed up a grown man, let alone a scrawny 12 to 14-year-old kid. And no, it wasn't a draft or stormy weather. This happened regardless of the conditions outside. And I remember one less intense event when I picked up the panel from the bottom of the stairs, fit it snugly back into the wall, turned around, took a few steps towards my side of the attic, and it did the same thing again. And I just straight up said, "All right, I'm leaving," packed it up, and did something else in the house. I'd gotten the hint. Now, most of these events happened during middle school in the late 90s when I was allowed to take over that space. We moved out when I was entering high school in 2000, and these things also occurred at other times when nobody was up there, usually at night, and I heard a lot of crap happening at all hours. My bedroom was right next to the door leading up there, under my father's side of the attic. However, the frequency of the noises and phenomena dramatically increased once I started spending my free time up there. I know for a fact that at least 2 of my friends experienced these events while they were at my house, and so did my younger brother, who was 3 years younger than me. Regrettably, I was kind of an a-hole to him around that time, and one of my friends and I locked him up there once. It was almost like the spirit had read the script because as soon as we locked him in, the panel at the top landing came off the wall. Notably, the panel directly above the door that he was desperately banging on did not come off that time, and he was screaming and crying to be let out like Michael Myers himself was up there. Now, this was a total dick move, I know, but middle school boys, what do you expect? He would have been around 10 or 11 at the time, so not super young. And to wrap things up, I drove by the place last summer and it looked like it was either being completely renovated or prepped for demolition. I got it into my head that I should talk to the current homeowners to see if they'd experienced anything similar, but I never went through with it. I drove by again earlier this summer and it looks like the renovations are done. There are visible improvements from the street and the dumpsters are gone. Still didn't find the stones to go ring the doorbell, though. So there's this woman, Paula, we'll call her. She's maybe 5'4", 85 pounds, originally from a country in South America, and freakishly strong. I used to take yoga with her, and we did aerials and pole together. And she's also nearing 60, but you would never guess. She's so fit and tiny and almost ageless in this very intense, wiry, even vibrant way. But I've never quite known what to make of her. I wouldn't say that we were close, though for a little while we started to get closer because we were around each other a lot. The thing is, she started subtly mirroring me. Doing her hair like mine, painting her nails the same color, styling herself in ways that felt oddly specific. She even bought me clothes, and it didn't feel like some sweet gesture. It felt off, like she wasn't admiring me, she was trying to wear me or be me. And then one day, we were at open pole together with one other person there, and the studio doesn't have dim lighting, it's actually very bright and fluorescent. And when she was doing this sort of sideways pole sit, and I could feel her watching me. We are both extremely flexible, but I have this sort of connective tissue disorder, so I have a slight edge on her, which isn't a big deal, but she is extremely competitive, probably even a covert narcissist. Now anyways, I'd just done something kind of splitty, and as I turned around to smile at her because it felt like she was looking at me, and when I did, her eyes were completely black. I mean fully black. I looked for several seconds because I couldn't look away. She just seemed almost vacant. Not checked out, but absent, like she'd gone somewhere momentarily and she was temporarily checked out. But yet it also felt like there was something in her place, an almost energetic placeholder. Something else seemed to be looking out through her, but it wasn't necessarily an intelligent being. I was left with this feeling of, I don't think I was supposed to see that, and I'm pretty sure she doesn't know that I saw this, but also I don't know if she was even aware of something happening. It was like when you accidentally see a mic in a movie or a crew wearing jeans in a film set in ancient Rome. It wasn't just a weird lighting thing. Again, bring fluorescent lights at the studio, or a blink. It was just unmistakable, and I've never seen anything like it before or since, and I'm also pretty positive nobody else saw it. Now, it only lasted a few moments. I finally stopped looking at her and walked over to the table where my stuff was and took a sip, and then everything was just sort of back to normal. Now, I know how this sounds. I try to rationalize it and gaslight myself into letting it go, but I can't. Not with everything else. The mirroring, the vibe, the way I never felt entirely at ease around her. I'd really love to hear what other people might make of it, because I honestly don't know if I'm reading too much into it, or not enough. I returned to my hometown because of TikTok, believe it or not. It sounds pathetic, but when you see viral posts about your best friend's sister who died of taking their own life when you were a kid, it kind of gets you curious, you know? And thankfully, all the posts seem to have been scrubbed from TikTok now for numerous rule breaking, but let me just explain a little. In my hometown, there's this ancient, legally protected tree that they just can't cut down. People want to cut it down because a girl unalived herself from one of the branches, my best friend's sister, in fact. And my best friend, who's no longer with us as a couple of years ago, also a victim of a similar fate, just like her sister. So you can imagine my ire when I saw all these local posts from kids filming the tree, claiming that you could see the specter of the girl if you looked just right, or got lucky with filming. Obviously, they never did, except for a handful of horrible AI slop fakes that rightfully got dunked on. But the very concept infuriated me. She wasn't the girl from the tree. She was Lena, a beautiful, tragic, and tortured 15-year-old who only ever wanted to be liked by the mean girls in her grade. Now, I could relate to her because I was the Lena of the year above, only I had her cool, bubbly sister Nora as a best friend, and in my grade, being a depressed goth girl was cool and kind of desirable. Unfortunately, Lena wasn't a depressed goth girl. She was just a depressed girl with bad acne and braces, and an awkward way with people, and nobody finds that a manic pixie dream girl. That's just someone to bully and never let her grow into herself. And part of me hates myself for being like her, but never being able to show her that it gets better because I was too caught up in my own BS to really notice how bad Lena was hurting. Nora noticed, but didn't know how bad. I guess that's why she never got over it either, and why she also eventually went the way she did. Now, I'm not really sure why I drove the 3 hours back to my hometown just because some dumb TikTok girls were filming that tree where my friend's sister had taken her own life. I guess a part of me wanted to catch one of them in the act, film it myself as I chewed them out, and post that on the app to see how they like them apples. I stayed in a motel because my parents had long since moved away and wouldn't have approved my homecoming for this reason anyway. It was a rundown, sleazy place back when I lived there and had seemingly gotten worse while I was gone. The desk clerk only just stared at my body as I checked in, and even went so far as to make some pretty lewd comment about how it was refreshing to see natural boobs in this day and age. I probably would have slapped the clerk silly if she hadn't been a woman who looked at least 75. And so every day I'd head to the park and just sit there with my ratty Nirvana hoodie and write my short stories on my phone while waiting to see some girls head to the tree. Then at night, I head back to the motel, get hit on by the old lady behind the counter who got more brazenly lewd as the days went on, and then lie on the uncomfortable motel bed watching the only channel the TV could pick up, which was just some adult channel, and wonder how people enjoy this kind of crap. Now, my hometown was as depressing and hopeless as when I'd run away from here when I was 17, maybe even more so. And not once did I see a single girl, let alone a giggling group, film that tree. And at the time, the posts were all suddenly disappearing from TikTok. Now, the accounts that had posted them were all being deleted, and it was like they never existed at all, and it felt like I was actually living in a dream. And then one day I showed up at the park. It was raining, a light drizzle that dampened my hoodie enough that I'd hoped that I might stop it from smelling bad until I could justify doing a laundry run. There was a girl standing at the foot of the tree, right under the branch where Lena had done what she'd done. She was dressed like I used to dress at that age, but with the kind of skin and gait and awkwardness that had separated Lena and I. Her presence at the tree angered me. What right did she have filming that tree when she just as easily could have been the one stringing herself up if her life had been different? Then I noticed that she didn't have a phone out. She was just standing there looking up at the branch. And suddenly I felt like a complete idiot. I judged this girl in my own way, and worse, in a way that Lena had been judged. And so I decided to speak to her, and I approached and put my friendliest voice on, which didn't amount to much, and asked if she was okay. The girl turned, very slowly, from looking at the branch. And she smiled at me, and I realized up close that she was very beautiful, almost breathtakingly so. How had I thought otherwise as I approached? I asked her again if she was okay, and she said she was, but that tomorrow would be better. Much better. And then she gave me the most beautiful, winning smile and walked past me, off into the fog of the park. I didn't turn to look until she'd gone so far as to be out of sight. And then I stepped to where she'd been. It didn't surprise me when I saw it there, somehow, as there was a coil of rope on the ground, exactly the right length to end it all from the branch if you were to climb up there. I picked up the rope and turned and walked away. A few steps away from the tree I heard it, the sound of the rope uncoiling, a body dropping, the snap of a neck, and I quickly turned around. There was nothing there, of course. I still held that rope in my arms, though. And me and Nora hadn't supported Lena. We'd laughed at her behind her back and sometimes to her face, and I'd wanted so badly to confront the people who were now turning her death into a spectacle, but they didn't even exist. When Lena died, the town had frozen, decaying in perpetuity. I threw the rope from the base of the tree into the trunk of my car and drove away from that town. I never looked back, and I can never make it up to Lena. She's gone forever, and sometimes you don't get a second chance, no matter how hard you might wish to be haunted by their ghosts like you deserve. Sometimes you're faced with only ever being alone. At 1:52 a.m., my phone rings. It's my husband. He had already texted me, letting me know that he was on his way home from work. Worried that something was wrong, I answer. I say, "Hey babe, you okay?" And there's silence. "Babe? Can you hear me?" "I can now, are you okay?" I respond. I don't know what just happened. I'm almost home, but I saw something. I'm about to lose service. Be waiting on me, please." I get out of my bed and stand at the front door waiting to see his headlights come down our long driveway. He gets in the door with a shocked look on his face, and this is what he says to me. I saw these things. These tall, white things. A tall, white woman with two other tall, white people. Not white like skin color, like snow white. They were standing out by the abandoned train tracks. The woman had what my brain could only compare to a trash bag with light. I know that's not what it was, but that's what it reminded me of. When I saw them, they noticed me too, and I just got this feeling. I can't explain it, but I just need to get out of there. It was like an unease came over me. I'm not sure what they were, but it wasn't right. They're not humans. Now I started reheating his dinner, and then it hit me. This automatically made me think of the tall whites. Now I googled tall whites and asked my husband if any of the photos were comparable, and he scrolled to one image and said, "Yeah, this is close." Now the next morning we decided to go back to where he saw them, and there was a black mark on the ground, like something scorched the earth. Now even more puzzling was that it had lightly rained the night before and it was raining when he saw them. Nobody lives in the area where he saw them. It's just an old one-lane road that connects to two larger roads and crosses the abandoned railroad tracks. We also live in the outskirts of a very tiny little town. It's unlikely that anyone was this far out, making a fire directly next to the road and tracks. And as we're walking towards the car, an old man in a beat-up old Ford pulls up beside us. Now he says, "Hey, what are y'all up to?" Neither of us recognized him, and we just nodded and said, We're just looking at something. Is our car in the way?" Now he puts the truck in park and gets out, and he says, "No, y'all are fine. Did you kids see something interesting?" And my husband responds, I saw something out here the other night on my way home from work. I'm not sure what it was, though." And the old man says, "Is that right? I live over that way. Have all my life," as he points to the highway. An awkward silence falls over us for a few seconds as we're walking to the car, and then he says, "Y'all believe in aliens?" My husband and I both look at each other. I say, "Yes, actually we do." And he goes on to tell us that he and his wife, his late wife, experienced a lot of strange occurrences over there over the years. Now he said the scorch marks were from them, and asked if we'd ever seen anything in the sky that was unidentifiable. Now my husband showed him a video that was taken a couple of months back of an unidentified flying object over our house. He invited us over to his house, saying that he had some images that he'd like to show us, and it may not have been the best decision, but we agreed. Now my husband actually has his carry permit, so I wasn't too worried if anything weird went down. Now we followed him to this old farmhouse, and he said his grandparents built the house back in the 1800s, and all of them had seen and experienced things on and around that property. He goes to a little garage/shack and retrieves some old Polaroid pictures, all 5 photos picturing your classic flying saucer. "My father took these," he said. "There's more in the house somewhere." And he goes on to tell us that he's not exactly sure where they come from or why they're here, but he knows there's different species and different kinds of crafts. Now I'd like to think that we gained a friend, but I'm still not 100% sure what my husband encountered. I just thought I'd share this story here and see if any of you think it's connected. From the time I was 7 years old until I was 12, my family lived in the front house and my aunt lived in the back house. From her living room, I could see out the front door. I began to notice that almost every night, I would see an older man wearing brown mechanic overalls and carrying a lunchbox stop at our front door. He would pause as if he were unlocking it and then enter the house. I told my aunt about the man, and she told me to let her know about it the next time I saw him. The following night, she was watching with me when I saw the man walking up our driveway. I called my aunt and we went outside. I asked her if she saw him, and she said that she did. We walked to my house and watched as the man stopped at the door, unlocked it, and entered the house. We followed him as he walked into the kitchen and placed his lunchbox on the counter. He turned around, almost facing us, and then disappeared. This happened for years until I decided to ask our neighbors, an elderly couple that all the neighborhood kids called Grandma and Grandpa, who had lived in the house before my family moved in. Grandpa asked me why, and I told him I was just curious. He told me that a man named Kenneth had lived there, and he was a mechanic and had a garden in the backyard that he loved. I asked why he moved out if he loved the house so much, and Grandpa told me that Kenneth was coming home from work one night when he died in a car accident. He never made it home. I said that was sad and that I hoped that he hadn't gone through any pain. Grandpa said that he passed instantly as soon as the two cars collided. I told my aunt what Grandpa said about Kenneth, and she told me that maybe I should talk to him about it. I was 12 years old and had been seeing this man for years. He never scared me, so I decided to try. He usually showed up at around 6 p.m., so I waited at the front door for him, and when he walked up the driveway, I spoke to him. I said, "Hello, Kenneth. You had an accident and never made it home from work. My family lives in your house now. You're free to keep coming back here every night, but there's a beautiful garden waiting for you on the other side. You're free, and I know that you miss your garden." Kenneth looked at the house and then down at the ground and then up at the sky. He disappeared for the last time and we never saw him again. I told my grandma and grandpa what I had done, and Grandma said that she had seen him walking down the street, but he always looked right through her. "He heard you. He saw you," she said, "and that is a very special thing. Don't ever forget that." So some years ago, my wife was caring for an elderly friend's mother during her final days. My wife has worked in care for many years, and as our friend's mother had advanced dementia, was entirely nonverbal and bedbound, the family needed some professional support to best help care for their mom. And as such, it was arranged that my wife would stay at their mom's house from Friday afternoon to the Sunday afternoon, as the family already took care of her around the clock during the week. And as the family has known me since childhood, they were more than happy for me to stay there over the weekend as well, and for our daughter, who had just turned 2 at the time, to be there as well with my wife, as my wife took care of their mom, who was bedbound in the lounge downstairs. And I knew the house well from my childhood, as it was right across the road from my friend's parents' house. As the family have known me since childhood, they were more than happy for me to stay there over the weekend as well, and for our daughter, who had just turned 2 at the time, to be there as well with my wife, as my wife took care of their mum, who was bedbound in the lounge downstairs. I knew the house well from my childhood, as it was right across the road from my friend's parents' house. And as a family, we had the second double room upstairs for my daughter and I, and my wife split the night between our upstairs room and a camp bed downstairs next to her patient for her hourly checks, as she had alarms set throughout the night. My daughter would toddle around the house and ask questions about the lady my wife cared for, who my daughter ended up referring to as Nana Flo. My daughter had explored the house thoroughly with my wife and I, but one day we went upstairs to go to our room, and she wouldn't cross the landing. She outright refused and began to cry. I picked her up and asked her what was wrong, and she told me that she was very scared. And I asked her why, and she said that she felt frightened and sad upstairs, so we went back down and she seemed happier. At bedtime, I got her to sleep downstairs and carried her asleep up to bed. And the following day, we went upstairs after breakfast to get her dressed, and she again wouldn't cross the landing. I asked her what was scaring her, and she pointed to the box room door. And I asked her what she was pointing at, and she said, "The scary door." And the door was exactly the same as all the other doors on the landing. Dark brown, no detail other than the wood grain and a right-angled brass handle. I told her that there was nothing scary about the door and opened it to show her inside the room. It was a small room used for storing things Flo hadn't used in the years since she was bedbound. A chair, some board games, and a couple of piles of her clothes and a wooden rocking chair that used to be in the garden. I motioned for my daughter to join me in the room to show her that it wasn't scary, but she refused to enter and kept well back. Now, I was beginning to wonder at this point, as she was always very sunny, a very smiley little girl, so I asked her why she didn't like the door or the room, and she said one word: died. I left the room, shut the door, and got her dressed. 2 weeks go by, and she still won't go near the door. But I either hurry her past whilst talking animatedly to her or carrying her, and just to clarify, I wasn't scared myself. Unnerved, definitely, but my daughter clearly was, and as I didn't want her to be, we just tried our best to deal with those moments quickly. Now, during one night, Flo slipped away in her sleep with my wife and daughter next to her holding her hand. We obviously didn't tell our daughter, as it would be a lot to process for a 2-year-old. I kept her upstairs, got her dressed, and packed our day bag as usual, and just got us ready to head downstairs and right out the front door so we didn't have to enter the lounge. As we got to the bottom of the stairs, Flo's adult daughter walked into the hall and saw us. Immediately seeing my daughter, she lit up and said hello to her in her cheeriest voice, considering the circumstances. My daughter suddenly took her hand and said, "Nana Flo's with the angels now." And her daughter just began crying and smiling quietly. We have no idea how she knew she'd passed. She'd passed maybe 3 hours previous, and my daughter and I had been maybe awake half an hour. And what's more, we're not a particularly religious family. My wife and I were both baptized, but we don't really attend church. And the first time my daughter attended church was 8 months later at a wedding, so we have no idea where she got the notion of angels from. And that will honestly stay with me forever. The craziest thing is that when my daughter was born, she didn't cry. She was so calm, and she also didn't cry on the way afterwards with my wife, even though all the other babies were. One older nurse commented to my wife, "She's been here before, that one." Maybe. So we moved to this house 2 years ago. Previous owners were here for 2 years. The ones before were here for a year, and the ones before that were here for a decade. They were the original owners. I'm not a witchy person, but I know that there's stuff out there that I can't explain. I know salt, ash, and blood are powerful tools, and 3 a.m. scares me. Now, I have a preschool-aged girl. My mother watches her while I work, and my mom sent me this text yesterday saying, "Creepy story. I forgot to plug in the kid's tablet, and it died. And while it was charging, she was on the floor playing with her dinosaurs. She got up, came over, and asked me, 'Why did you open my door?' And her door is closed. I told her that no one opened her door and that it is closed, and she said that a person opened her door and stomped into her room and that they were wearing stripes all over. And I asked her when this happened, and she just kept repeating the story. I stopped myself from asking if it scared her and didn't want to put that idea into her head. I wasn't sure how to ask her how it made her feel, and she seemed to be more curious than scared. Now, around this time last year, my kid kept walking up crying about angry eyebrows in her walls, and I had her help me rub her walls with salt and burned a candle. Apparently it helped a lot, and she hadn't been scared or said anything creepy since until yesterday. And then last night, while I was putting her to bed, she kept looking at her door and quietly sobbing, saying, oh no, and hiding her face. I couldn't get any info out of her, but I had a very icky off feeling. Middle of the night, at 3:48, there was a loud thud picked up by our baby monitor, but nothing to cause it, and she didn't wake up. I'm trying to convince myself that this was just the cat being a cat, though nothing in the hallway was disturbed. The monitor doesn't record, and it's just a cheap one, basically almost like a walkie-talkie. But what do? What can I do? Should I get my kid into therapy? Should I burn some sage that I grew myself? Not smudging, as that's a closed practice. I just know that it's a cleansing plant. Should I salt her room again? Add ash? I tried asking in the witch subreddit and then the spells subreddit, and they both said that this belonged here in r/paranormal. Instead, then deleted my posts. Just help me out because I'm scared. So last October, I moved to Hawaii completely alone. I was unhappy with my life back home and needed a change. I left behind a decently well-paying job that I hated and took a leap of faith, even though I only knew one person on the island. The transition was hard. There were days that I questioned why I had come and what I was looking for. And one afternoon, while playing pickleball, a man approached me. And it was a black man with the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. And we started chatting casually, and then, out of nowhere, he began telling me things about my life that no stranger could possibly know. He said I was from Chicago. He named the exact 2 streets my old apartment in Chicago was located, and he said that I had 3 brothers, which I told him no. And after a minute, I realized that he was talking about my blood brother and my 2 stepbrothers. I don't see my stepbrothers, so I don't even think about that right away. and he told me that I was Polish and spoke about the close bond that I have with my mother, and every detail was true. I was completely stunned. My first thought was that he might be a stalker, but the conversation continued. He told me he had this sense, and that I was meant to speak with him. And without me mentioning my career, he said that I would soon find a job that I truly love. And then he told me that I'd meet my person and be married at 27, and that I'd have 3 children. I am a 24-year-old female, and those were all things that I've been quietly worrying about. And as strange as it all was, I didn't feel afraid. I felt this very deep sense of peace, like I was exactly where I needed to be. And when it was my turn to play, we wrapped up our conversation, and he said something like, "I'm always here. You'll find me around." And I walked toward the court, but after only a few seconds, I turned back to look for him, and he was gone. Completely vanished. The courts were fenced in, so there was no way that he could have just walked off unnoticed in that short amount of time, and also wired so I wouldn't be able to see him even if he did. I played there often and have never seen him again, and it was one of the most surreal and unexplainable moments of my life, and I still think about it all the time. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was laying in the front bedroom of my great-grandparents' large home my mother inherited. And there was an entire upstairs apartment not being used, and it was a large 3-bedroom home on the first floor. Upstairs were 3 more bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bathroom. And my mom was about to rent the upstairs out, but saving it for a relative whose lease was up. And my mom and her entire family grew up in that home. And by this time, my great-grandparents had passed on, but my grandparents were still alive. Now, I often watched television in bed with my mom when I was that young and would either fall asleep in her room or go to my room, which was closer to the back of the home. Now, it was Friday night, so I was allowed to stay up late. At around 11:30 p.m., we heard a very loud noise of someone entering the home through the back door. Now, you have to pass through the dining room, living room, and kitchen to get to the back of the home, and you cannot see the back door until you've reached the kitchen. My mom grabbed her gun, and I remember grabbing a metal candle holder, and she told me to stay in the room and hide, but I refused. I wasn't going to let her go alone, and I was scared, so I trailed behind her with my weapon. My mom had her gun drawn, making her way to the back room, ready to blow someone's brains out, and when we reached the back room, the room was glowing. We only saw it for maybe 2 to 3 seconds, and then it went pitch black. And after the glow went away, we saw the back door wide open with a men's size 12 mud print on the door where someone had kicked it in, and there was no one in sight. When my mom tried to call 911, the phone line was dead, and we later found out that it had been cut. She had a panic button that alerted the police in the front room, and the alarm had not yet been set, but the button actually worked, and help came within 6 or 7 minutes. This happened in 1994, over 30 years ago. However, I have always believed that someone came there with the intentions of doing us harm, and I also believe when they kicked down that door, they saw something that scared the life out of them, and they took off running. I believe it was our relatives protecting us in that family home. I saw the glow clear as day, and it was almost this purple color, almost like a lit gas pilot on a stove would look like, and my mother saw it as well. We never talked about the glow until I got older, and she never mentioned it to anyone, I don't think. Now, we had the conversation when I was about 20 and talked about the glow, and she looked at me in complete shock and said, "Oh my God, you saw that too." So take this with a pound of salt. I understand this is crazy and probably my brain doing some weird stuff, so yes, I know this probably all means nothing, but this has been in my brain for so long that I just gotta get it out. When I, now an 18-year-old female, was in 2nd grade, I rode the bus to and from school with my older brother, and no particular memories stand out, but a few related to this girl named Tina. And since my brother is a couple of years older than me, he sat towards the back of the bus while I sat in the middle, and a couple of random people would sit next to me in the morning towards the beginning of the year until people found the person that they wanted to sit next to for the whole year. One day, this girl that I had never seen before sat next to me, and this weird smell overwhelmed me. It was like this stale smell that didn't smell bad, but also smelled old and musty. I'm sorry, I literally can't explain it because I only recognized it when I smell it, so this Tina was a few grades above me, but other than that, nothing stood out about her. She looked like every other kid in the school, and the only thing off was the way that she smelled because it was something that I'd never smelled before in my then 6 years of life, lol. Now, I don't remember how we became friends, but we did, and after about a week of knowing each other, she told me on a Monday that she had a secret that she had to tell me the following Tuesday. Now, I was hyped for a week waiting, and when the day finally came, she told me she was a vampire. Now, at 6 years old, I did know what a vampire was, and that they were not real and only in cartoons like Adventure Time, and so when she said this, I knew that she was lying and just sort of confused. But when I told her I didn't believe her, she said that she'd prove it to me, and this is something I'll never forget because I remember it so vividly. She told me that vampires grant wishes, which was something I had never heard about vampires, so I didn't really believe that either. But she insisted and said that if I wished to become a vampire, she would make me one, and that had proved that she was one. And so, since I didn't believe her, I agreed and wished I was a vampire, and she snapped her fingers and told me to look in the bus driver's front mirror, and since I was sitting on the outside toward the aisle, I leaned out and saw nothing in the mirror. I started to freak out, and I'm telling you, I don't know if the girl was a magician or what the frick happened, but I was not in that mirror. And so I started freaking out, and she calms me down and tells me, wish not to be a vampire. And I do, and my reflection comes back in the mirror. After that, I believed her and started picking up on other details. For one, she didn't have fangs. She had those sort of lucky teeth that Kirsten Dunst has where the canines aren't sharp but stick out from the front, which kind of gave her a lisp. And she also didn't ride the bus in the afternoon unless it was raining or the sun wasn't out. And I mean that with no exaggeration. She never rode the bus on a sunny day. She seemed to be committed to the bit. And the last thing that became an occurrence was that she would regularly remind me not to tell anyone that she was a vampire or she'd wish that I never existed. That didn't really scare me, but it was kind of off-putting. Like, okay, girl, I won't. Now, something I want to mention, but I low-key doesn't really matter, is that she accused a guy in my grade named Kevin of being a werewolf. Like, okay, I guess so. So about a week after the wish thing, she told me that I could get one wish every Tuesday. And I wish I could tell y'all what I wished for, but if I remember correctly, I would tell her that I couldn't think of a wish every time for some reason. I don't know why, I just remember being like, I don't know, let me think. And then the next day I'd have a wish and she would say, girl, it's Wednesday, so no. Now, I never got bad vibes from her or anything either. It just felt like I was the only one who knew her generally since no one else talked to her on the bus and we were in different grades, her being in 5th and me in 2nd. I never saw her once we stepped off the bus either. Generally, for a long time after all of this stopped, I figured that this young girl who had seen Twilight and was obsessed, but then I remember what happened the last time I saw her. The last time I saw her was a Tuesday, and instead of granting me a wish, she told me that there was a monster party happening that night, and she wanted me to sneak out of my house and come. Now, I was intrigued, but didn't really comment, so just went, okay, sure. And I asked her where it was, and she said that it had come to me in a dream because that's how vampires kept secrets, and I just kind of forgot about the whole thing once I got off the bus since I had no intention of going anyway since I was literally probably 5 or something. Now anyways, after forgetting about it all day, when I went to sleep that night, I had a crazy dream. I dreamed that I was at a party, and there were so many stereotypical monsters there. They weren't exaggerated to be scary, they literally looked like there were 1900s movie counterparts as I walked through the room, so it just looked like a bunch of monsters drinking from red cups like I saw on TV. And as I walked through, I saw a vampire who looked like Dracula. Pale skin, widow's peak, long fangs, and cloak. And as I walked through to reach him, I noticed that there was this big hole in the middle of the floor that looked like a cliff behind him. And when I got to him, He said something to me that I remember for a long time but recently forgot, and it was nothing scary though, just sort of a remark saying, "Oh, you've made it," or something along those lines. And as we were talking, he moved in a way that I followed to hear what he was saying, not realizing that he was turning me around so that the cliff was now next to me. And at some point I ended up slipping and holding onto the cliff with both hands, begging for him to let me up, and he just stood there for a bit. There was no urgency in the dream at all. From me asking for help to him not moving to help, it all felt very calm. And eventually he bent down and started to lift my fingers up so I wasn't gripping the cliff until I eventually fell to my death. And now the way my dream works is that they play out like a movie. So they're not in first person, and while I never see my own face, I see various perspectives. And so I felt it was as if a camera watched me go down and hit the ground. The dream didn't end when I hit the ground either, it kind of stayed and I saw myself on the ground dead. Now, it was so surreal to think about because it was so randomly graphic and nothing surrounding my interactions with her before that ever gave anything sinister, besides her last interaction with me leading up to the dream. And after that night I never saw her again, and weirdly it took me a couple of years to realize her connection to my dream. That smell has never left me, and neither has that dream since I never remember my dreams and can only recount like 5 I've ever really had. And I occasionally get reminded of this whole thing when I meet someone who smells like her, which has been maybe 4 times since. Overall, she probably wasn't a vampire, but between the bus mirror thing that actually did happen and I can't refute, and the crazy dream, I don't know. I know the mind can make up some crazy stuff, but I remember anything down to a T like that, and I really don't know what to say. I'm not religious and have a difficult relationship with the paranormal stuff, and whether I believe in it or not, but that's probably something I'll post about later. So just some background on my family's beliefs. I am spiritual, and my mother is Christian Orthodox, but a more spiritual denomination of it, and my father is absolutely atheist. The first encounter happened this time last year. I was home alone and sitting in my kitchen at the dining table, and from where I was sitting, I was able to see the front door into the living room and the back door into the living room leading into the garden, just to give some context to the layout. I was eating my food and looked up and saw a black, shadowy figure standing inside the house by the back door. I was instantly paralyzed with a sense of impending doom. Every time I looked away, it seemed to reach towards me, so I was unable to move and unable to look away. One thing to note is that after about 5 minutes of me looking at it, my cat started yowling at the front door to be let in. One thing about him is that he rarely meows, and on the rare occasion he does, it is extremely quiet, and this is the first time that I had heard him meow like that. After a few more minutes, I became hysterical and started screaming and crying. And the entire thing lasted about 40 minutes until my mom came home and got me out of my hysterical state. Now, another thing to note is that when the front door opened and my mom came in, and I did not recognize it as her, nor as a human, and I fell to the floor in fear. She immediately got me up and cleansed the entire house and all of the doorways. Now, I put this experience down to being a stress-induced hallucination, as I was going through a very stressful time then, or due to the new hormonal medication that I've been put on, hallucinations being a very rare side effect. Now, this was until the second encounter. I had been away from home the past 2 days, and when I got back today, my dad told me that he had seen a ghost, and when he took a picture of it, it disappeared next time he looked. Now, I was taken aback as he doesn't believe in the paranormal at all and does not joke about things like this. I asked to see the picture, and in the picture, I saw exactly what I had seen this time last year. I will attach the image that he took where you will see to the left of it the back door where the original instance occurred. I'm very worried, as my friend pointed out, that it has moved from the back door to the living room window, and due to the layout of my house, the entrance/viewpoint is my glass front door, and I suppose I'm looking for an explanation or any advice. I'm very frightened and I'm just not sure what to do. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. You can find all the links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't cry, be spry. A few years ago, after I'd left college and wasn't really ready to become a career adult yet, I took a job working as a fry cook at a local fast food restaurant. It wasn't a chain restaurant, it was one of those where the signage and font try and make it look like it's KFC or something, but it obviously isn't. And everything from the hygiene to the menu to the prices make it clear that it's knockoff, and people freaking love these places. Fried chicken and fries for $1 cheaper than KFC? Hell yeah, sign me up. And so it was actually rewarding work. I didn't get paid much, but I was pushing my body to the limit, while at the same time I was doing a long-term master's degree, so it felt like a really productive member of society, and I don't know why I'm justifying all of this to you. And if you want to spend your entire damn life working fast food, more power to you. The world would be an inferior place if we couldn't just go to our local McDaniel's or Arkansas Fried Chicken or Out and About Burger or, the official ones. Now anyways, the point is, I'm not really sure how the hygiene and waste disposal and official things work in the big brand franchise restaurants. What I do know is that at the little local-owned store that I worked at, which I'm just going to call Bugger Kong, things worked in a very certain way. And one of those ways was we had a big metal oil drum out back where we'd dump the used oil from the fryer when it was time to change it. And then we just kind of left the barrel alone until it got full enough to get one of the guys to haul it to God knows wherever it was that they disposed of a big old barrel of vegetable oil. I should also mention that while the barrel had a lid, it was kind of just placed on there. Just enough so it didn't fill the barrel with rain and cause us to have to take disposal trips early. But if someone had wanted to go into the barrel, then they could pretty easily. But why the heck would anyone want to go into a barrel of used, dirty cooking oil? It's not like there was any good reason to keep it under lock and key, right? It was out back, in the chain fenced-off area with the dumpsters and all other types of gross crap. So I was General Chick Who Does Whatever Needs Doing as my official title. Go-To Georgie, they called me, because, well, my name's Georgia, and people would come to me whenever some crap needed doing. Short of staff on the front counter? Ask Georgie. Need puke mopped up from the floor in the tiny seating area? Yep, me. But my main job there, which I was damn good at for what the job entailed, was fry cook. I flipped a burger meaner than a dad with a midlife crisis and a kiss the cook apron on. And I had more than one customer, always middle-aged men who liked the cut of my uniform, jib, tell me that they liked coming in best when I was on the grill. And yeah, look, I was a sassy, fairly hot postgrad working in a grungy fast food restaurant. I've seen Kevin Smith movies, and I know it makes me look cool to play up to this. Sue me. And if you want to picture me, at least back then, I looked a bit like that chick who's the singer of Linkin Park now, but in my early 20s, with more piercings and a singing voice that'd make your ears bleed. And I know none of this is massively relevant, but I want you to have the perfect picture of the scene just so it makes sense when I perfectly, in minute and explicit detail, describe the visuals of what happened that day. You'll thank me, trust me. So one day, I've been working the griddle all day and I was just about DWTS, done with this crap, but I used to say it like that to A, make me sound cool, and B, avoid getting scolded by my very sweet Christian mother. And so, of course, right at the end of my shift, just as the sun was about to set, my manager Karen, yes, their actual name, who never liked me, told me that I had to haul my butt out into the back lot, lugging that oil with me, and dump it in the barrel. Oh, and that should be the last of it, so I had to call on the boys to come collect it in the morning. And sure, they're gonna love that. And there's a way that you drain the oil of our fryers that lets you drain the oil into 5-gallon buckets. Thankfully, it was all cooled by now because the fryer hadn't been used for a while, so it was safe to drain the first 5-gallon bucket and strain my whole entire butt, dragging it out the back door backwards. And as soon as I got outside into the little chained-off backyard that served as our exterior area, I knew something was wrong. I'd spent plenty of time out here on my cigarette breaks, and it always stank, but this time it stank to high heaven. So I placed the oil bucket down in front of the back door to stop it slamming shut, and I turned around to see exactly what had caused our garbage area to stink worse than Satan's taint. First thing I saw was rotten food just sort of strewn all over the ground. The wild thing here is our dumpster had been emptied that morning, so there was no way that the rotten food had come from our restaurant. Someone had brought it here, and that someone, well, it was pretty clear who she was. And the first thing I noted was a shopping cart, adorned with all types of trinkets and decorations like you often see homeless folks pushing around. And then I saw the presumably homeless lady herself, and she was, I kid you not, in the oil barrel. She was absolutely covered in weeks of old, filthy cooking oil. She hadn't seen me looking, and as I watched, she ducked into the barrel and submerged herself in the liquid. I actually counted. She was down in that oil for 45 seconds, and then she burst out, letting out a gasp of what I can only describe as ecstasy. Her mouth was thrown wide open, cooking oil pouring from her mouth, and then she saw me. She spat a wad of cooking oil straight at me, thankfully nowhere near close enough to hit me, but still I backed away. And did I mention that this woman was extremely, depressingly old and also extremely naked? I could only see her bare, saggy chest at this point, but I later saw the full glory of her nudity, so I can say with confidence that she was naked, diving in our oil barrel. Despite what I said, I'm not going to go into detail describing an emaciated, sore-ridden octogenarian covered in cooking oil coming bursting out of the barrel. You can probably imagine what that looks like. But when she saw me and spat the oil at me, it was like a switch flipped in her brain. Maybe it was the shame of getting caught taking an oil bath surrounded by rotten food, but I doubt it. She did, however, start absolutely shrieking at me and pointing a very gnarled accusatory finger. If it had been the 1690s, then I would have been straight up on WhatsApp to the latest witch finder, telling them that we had some witch burning to do. But alas, this was 2023 at the time, so all I was able to do was kind of back away and say, "Hey lady, chill out. You just can't stay in our barrel of oil." And the oil lady started thrashing, shrieking about this, and I could tell what was going to happen. She was angrily reaching out towards me, flailing with rage and fury, so of course, yes, the entire barrel of oil tumbled forward, sending foul-smelling vegetable oil flooding across the lot. I tried to jump back further but hit the wall. In my infinite wisdom, I decided to kick the bucket. Not in that way, but I mean the bucket that was propping the door open. I didn't want any of this crap getting into the kitchen and giving Karen an excuse to Karen at me. And the barrel of oil managed to topple forward towards this woman, and the back door of the restaurant slammed shut, i.e. locked. And this meant that I was trapped with this oil woman in a small fenced-in area. Another thing I noticed was that the oil barrel appeared to be filled with more rotting food, and we certainly hadn't been putting it in there, and I had this horrible feeling from the state of it that the old woman had taken the food into the barrel with her and had been eating it underwater. Well, under oil, I guess. The ancient oil-covered naked woman was crawling across the asphalt toward me, occasionally trying to get her feet and then slipping each time. Now I was torn. What the hell did I do? I felt bad for this clearly mentally ill old lady homeless person covered in cooking oil and chowing down on rotten garbage, but she was also crawling towards me like some kind of disgusting fetish weirdo from the garage, and from the look on her face, she had slippery murder in mind. The fact that she was screaming at me, calling me a witch and saying that she was going to tear my insides out and fill my hoo-ha with oil wasn't exactly filling me with charity towards helping this lunatic either. And so I did maybe the most epic move of my life. I ran around the oil spill, aiming for the dumpster. I was going to climb on the top, but then leap over the 8-foot chain fence, leaving this woman trapped inside the lot, and then I'd go around the front of the restaurant and call the cops. This was mostly a good idea, except I misjudged how fast the oil woman could slide across the ground in her oily nakedness, and I was almost at the dumpster when she grabbed my ankle, her slippery hands trying to drag me into the slimy puddle that she was rolling in. Hell no, I was having none of this, and so I did probably the worst thing that I'd ever have to do in my life. I stamped on an 80-plus-year-old woman's wrist. I wasn't proud of it, but it worked, and she howled and let go. Now listen, if you saw her, if you saw how clearly strong and weird this woman was despite her age, then you wouldn't judge me. Hell, for all I know, she was in her 40s and just aged really badly from meth or some other drugs. So, as she rolled around in pain, I knocked her stupid, dumb shopping cart out of the way and threw myself on top of the dumpster and took the leap of my life to expertly vault over the chain-link fence. The oil coating my sneakers and hands didn't quite allow this plan to come to pass, and I almost managed it. Instead, my pants caught on the chain-link fence and I was left hanging upside down, blissfully on the outside of the yard, but somehow caught by the tear in my knee of my jeans, so I was just sort of hanging there upside down. And there was a moment where I was considering that I could undo my belt and slip out of my pants and fall to the ground in my underwear, but there was already a naked elderly lady in gallons of oil. There was no way that I was turning this into more of an effed up weird concept than it already was, and instead, I shamelessly and tearfully started screaming for help. Thankfully, a passerby saw me and helped me down, and then recoiled in absolute horror when they saw the scene that I just escaped from. Now, short ending to a long story, I limped my way back to the restaurant while this passerby very kindly kept an eye out on the old woman just in case she found some way to try and escape. And how she'd gotten in, shopping cart included, was absolutely beyond me, and the best I could think is that she'd picked the padlock to the yard and then for some reason locked it behind her again. It didn't feel like this was the first time that she'd taken a bath in our oil. It felt almost too planned. Now Karen handled it, called the cops, and I gave a statement, and then got sent home for the day. I never really found out much about that old lady. All I knew was that she definitely wasn't pressing charges, and she was getting the help that she needed, so I guess that was nice. Now listen, I tried to make this sound as funny as possible, but the whole thing was absolutely freaking terrifying, and the only way that I can handle the story is really by joking about it. I still have genuine nightmares about her bursting out of that barrel, oil pouring from mouth and screaming just gibberish at me. I still get sick if I smell anything rotting, and I absolutely do not work in fast food anymore. I just can't. And I know the event could have happened anywhere with a drum of oil, I guess, but I can't handle the idea of ever encountering anything like that again. I mean, could you? No matter how I try and turn this into comedy, it's the most horrifying thing I've ever dealt with, and I hope to all that is holy that I never, ever have a reason to share a story like this ever again. But you know, if you want to use a terrifying woman bursting out of an oil drum as the video thumbnail, I think that I'd probably be okay with that. Maybe. At least something positive could come from this absolute crap show. When I was around 18, myself and my now husband went out to a fancy restaurant for dinner. We live in a small rural town, so the restaurant was one of those which is out in the middle of nowhere and pretty exclusive. Now this was many years ago, and my husband's father was kind of somebody in our small town, so we managed to get a booking. Now we turned up at around 8 and were seated, and as an 18-year-old girl who grew up poor, I felt like a darn celebrity. as the restaurant was filled with other diners, mostly middle-aged, upper-class folks who definitely looked like they belonged there. And I felt a bit like a fish out of water, but I guess this is why I was so relieved when the couple seated beside us struck up a conversation. They were clearly rich and well-to-do. The one was one of those glamorous old women who look like they're the murderous widow in some drama, and the husband, though, he clearly had done pretty well for himself and clearly enjoyed doing well for himself. His fingers were very swollen and his nose was red with these sort of burst blood vessels, and he had a very well-groomed and well-trimmed white beard and this balding head, but there were nicotine stains on his teeth and facial hair that I could see, and this was back in the days before teeth whitening made every rich person look like they had immaculate dental hygiene. I don't remember what we chatted about, and frankly, I didn't care. It was pleasant and fun, though, and they made us feel extremely welcome. Well, they made me feel welcome anyway. My husband was more used to attending higher-class restaurants like this with his family. And speaking of my husband, he stepped outside for a cigarette break. You could smoke inside restaurants back then, but we always opted to sit in the no-smoking section, because even back then it was pretty disgusting to eat your dinner surrounded by other people's secondhand smoke. My husband would typically spend about 10 minutes on a cigarette break before a meal, as he'd have a couple beforehand so he could go until after dessert for the next one. Food used to take between 30 minutes to an hour to arrive from the kitchen back then, and it was considered totally normal to wait for your meal for that long, so this was his first cigarette break. Now, a minute or so after my husband stepped outside, this rich wife excused herself to powder her nose, and I just sat there sort of playing with my cutlery and giving the rich husband a polite smile every now and then because I couldn't help notice that he was kind of looking at me a lot. And then the rich husband looked around the restaurant, leaned across the table towards me and whispered, "I love you." And then he sat back in his seat and loudly began to talk about how great this place was and said hi to another nearby group who were dining that he clearly knew. And it was so bizarre, and I almost wondered if I'd actually misheard it. I looked over my shoulder and saw my husband outside smoking, and I tried to catch his eye. Nothing doing there. Now, the wife still wasn't back from the bathroom yet, and this husband took a sip of wine, which stained his teeth red, and then he leaned towards me again and whispered, "I love you," and then went back to acting normally. His wife returned from the bathroom. My husband returned from his smoke break. 3 more times that evening, I ended up alone with this rich husband. At no point did I manage to end up alone with my husband to tell him what was going on, though. I was alone with the rich wife at one point, but she was engaged in conversation with a group of old ladies 2 tables over, and on top of that, I just felt too nervous to bring it up with her. Remember, I was literally just 18. I grew up poor, and I was surrounded by people who I could easily imagine eating someone like me just for the thrill of it. And the next time I was alone with that rich husband, he did the same thing 3 more times. Leaned in and whispered, "I love you," and then sat back with a sort of satisfied smile on his face. The second time, there were 2 "I love yous" and 1 "I really love you." Now, I was bracing myself for things to start turning weirder. You could tell from the way he was looking me up and down that pure romantic love was not exactly what he meant by his words. And the third time it was, "I love you," and then "I really love you," and then glancing around the restaurant to check nobody was looking. He directed his, and thus my, gaze to the tabletop at his waist. And I couldn't see anything, obviously, but the way the tablecloth was bunched up and the way his arm had disappeared beneath the table, he was definitely giving the impression that he was squeezing himself down there. And then he leaned across, and in the most weird and creepy whisper yet, he said it again. "I love you." And then conveniently, his wife got back to the table, and he started telling her about something that had happened at the office that he'd forgotten to tell her about, but absolutely positively had to share with her. And I just felt frozen, sick, and scared. I had no idea what to do. And of course, I had unpleasant experiences with men before as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenage girl, but you kind of expected to avoid that type of thing in this very high-end restaurant when your partner and his wife were so present. And to top it all off, I felt way too concerned about embarrassing my husband to be in front of his people. He knew some of the other diners, if not this couple themselves, and other than the weird I love yous, the conversation with the couple had been entirely pleasant and, dare I say, even enjoyable. I would have happily befriended them if not for this creepy weirdness that was coming out of the guy. And as it happened, and at the time I believed it to be a coincidence, we finished our meal at the same time as the older couple, both paid at the same time, and both made to leave at once. My husband paid on his credit card, but the rich wife was the one to handle their bill. The rich husband sort of sidled up next to me and I sort of froze, terrified of what he was going to say next. Instead of saying anything lewd, he just simply said it would be absolutely charming to meet myself and my partner, and perhaps we could officially dine together at some point. And then he gave me his business card. And yes, it was one that Patrick Bateman would have scoffed at, in case you're wondering. But the point is, not only did he give me his business card, but it had his home telephone number on it. The rich husband and rich wife sort of walked us to our car, and as I climbed into the passenger seat, he said, "Remember what I told you?" And when my husband looked at him sort of confused, he said that he suggested that we all dine out together again, and I had their card. But I know that's not what he meant, though. I knew that he meant the I love yous. So that was my creepy first encounter where rich people go to dine. Was it really scary? Well, not yet, but believe it or not, this was the prelude. On the drive home, I told my husband to be everything. He is a very calm and peaceful and spiritual man. But back when we were both 18, as he's just 3 months older than me, he was, well, let's just say pretty hot-headed and protective of me in a way that verged on jealousy. And now he was so angry that he almost steered the car off the road. But I made him swear to keep him calm and listen to me and promise that he wouldn't turn that car around or pull in and wait for the couple to pass so he could chase them down or anything stupid like that. And to his credit, he agreed with me. And then I got to the final bit and I told him that I had the guy's business card. Now he smiled quietly, and then when we got home, he asked me to give him the business card. And I lived with him at his mom and stepdad's house for reasons I won't go into. They were pretty bohemian about it since we were technically together before marriage. And I gave him the card after he swore me 2 things. One, that he wouldn't do anything for a few days until we had time to think about it. And 2, he wouldn't just go around to their house, which we discovered was almost this sort of stately home. And when we swore to both, I gave him the business card. And what my husband did should have been the perfect revenge. It should have absolutely effed things up for the rich husband and revealed him for the weirdo that he is. But it didn't, and that's what creeps me out the most. What my husband did was call up the number and ask to speak to the rich wife, and it was her that he confronted. He told her all about her husband's harassment of me, and he may have embellished a little even because, screw it, but he made it very clear that her husband had been trying to behave creepily towards me and hinted that I should contact him for some kind of encounter. I was listening in on the other line, as that's how landlines work those days, and I was completely chilled when I heard the rich wife start laughing in a very cold and callous way. Now my husband-to-be kept on ranting about how uncomfortable the creepy old dude had made me, and maybe she wasn't grasping the fact that he intended to cheat on her. And this rich wife said something like, "Are you finished?" He only told her that he loved her. Gareth can be a bit much sometimes, she says. And then it hit me. Pretty much every time I'd been alone with that rich husband, my own husband had left first, and then rich wife had found an excuse to take an extended break from the table and always ensured that I was alone with her husband. Then she said one final thing that I'll never forget, which creeped me out more than any way rich husband, aka this Gareth, had made me feel. She said to my husband that maybe he should stop taking things so seriously and take them up on their offer of dinner today. And that she was sure a couple of our means would appreciate being able to dine with the likes of them. And we both looked like our company could help rejuvenate their marriage. Now there was no doubt about it then. They were goddamn predatory swingers, maybe worse, who thought that we were just some young poor couple spending what little we had at some swanky restaurant. My husband had a tendency to dress down because he had the whole embarrassed rich kid thing, so it made some sense. And so my husband, keeping calm, said thank you for the invite, and maybe he'd check in with his father because perhaps he was familiar and maybe we could all dine together as a family. As soon as Rich Wife had heard my husband's father's name, she responded rather quickly that maybe we'd have to see, but perhaps it was best that we took a rain check, and then she hung up. And that was just about the one time when my husband was actually to use his birth father's reputation in our small town to scare this pair of creeps. And you can probably imagine the type of rich character my father-in-law was, given that the very mention of his name caused a pair of very creepy, probably even murderous swingers to back off in fear. But that, my friends, is a very much different story. In my very early 20s, I was a waitress at a small family-owned chain in my hometown. There wasn't anything particularly notable about the restaurant. It was pretty beloved in my town, and the food was great quality. Man, our chefs were chef's kiss. And in the evenings, it had this lovely mood lighting that made the place feel incredibly romantic, even if it was a bit dark at times. I got the job after dining there with my then boyfriend, Jono, for around the 5th time, and he noticed a help wanted sign in the window. It seemed like a perfect fit since I was looking for a job for my last couple of years of college, and I already knew a bunch of the restaurant staff, either through dining there or because I was friends with a couple of the waitresses. Things went great for the first few months there. I was having a blast and genuinely enjoying the work while still finding time for my studies. Unfortunately, working at the restaurant led to a little turmoil in my life as well. There was a male coworker who I'd become good friends with, purely platonic, but my boyfriend couldn't be convinced to see it that way. And one day he turned up at closing time to catch me and my coworker Brandon at it. By at it, in this case, he meant Brandon was walking me to my car in the dark, something he did every time we worked the night shift because, well, I don't need to explain why a male friend might do that for a female friend, do I? Unfortunately, my boyfriend couldn't quite grasp this concept, and he absolutely lost his goddamn mind. He accused Brandon of trying to steal his girl, and then started screaming in the parking lot about all types of these STDs I had. Now, it didn't stop there either. He started coming into the restaurant during busy evening hours, pointing at me and yelling to everyone that I was a, well, loose woman, and that even more embarrassing, he was deciding that to start sharing very intimate, very true facts about my body that were just kind of things that you don't want diners at a restaurant or your colleagues to hear about, you know? It was horrible, having someone show up out of the blue to randomly yell something unpleasant about how one of my breasts was smaller than the other and I was insecure about it, or the kind of things I liked in bed. And my now ex-boyfriend was banned from the restaurant, and I was given a couple of weeks of compassionate leave. During this time, I got a restraining order filed against him, and the security camera footage from the restaurant as well as witness testimony made it pretty simple and easy of a process. But still, I was devastated. I felt like I had no choice but to quit my job because the longer I stayed, the more sick that I felt about going back to face everyone. And eventually Brandon gave me a much-needed pep talk and convinced me that I was super valued as an employee and that they'd be gutted to lose me. And his well-meaning guilt trip worked, and I eventually returned to work. And now, enter the third player in the story. His name was Howie, and he was the assistant manager of our little family. Up until this point, Howie had been polite but distant with me. Not rude or anything, but not particularly interested in me as anything more than a colleague either. And on the day that I returned to work, though, he called me into his office and told me that Jono would not be darkening the door of our establishment again, and that he'd personally make sure of it. I wasn't sure how he could promise that since it would require him to work the exact same shifts as me, which surely he wouldn't be doing. But it turns out I was wrong. He'd arranged things so we worked at exactly the same times, at all times, and that was just the first red flag. The next, which I should have taken more seriously, was when he called me into his office again a few days later and started addressing the horrible things Jono had said about me. He said that he knew that I didn't have STDs, Jonah claimed, because I obviously wasn't that type of girl, which isn't how STDs work, buddy, but I liked my job and wanted to keep it, so I just kept quiet on that. Now next, he started talking about how I shouldn't be insecure about my breasts. So what if one of them was smaller than the other? He'd never noticed, and in fact, he thought they looked great. And he took this as an opportunity to gesture and stare at my chest as if he was doing me a favor. And then, the third and most intolerable red flag, there had been a certain proclivity that Jono had repeatedly yelled that I was into in front of colleagues and customers. Nothing I think anyone should be ashamed of, but not something that a young woman particularly once broadcasted to coworkers and strangers. And Howie reassured me repeatedly that it was fine that I was into this particular thing. And then he started telling me about how one of his current girlfriends, yup, phrased just like that, was also into it, and she told him that he was really good at pleasing her in that manner. And then he sort of paused as if waiting for me to respond with, I don't know. A request to experience this, I guess. The man was in his goddamn 40s, by the way, and surely he knew that that wouldn't work. And so now, I'd gone from one surprise abusive ex to a surprise creepy boss. They always say bad luck comes in threes, right? And so that night, at a bar after work, I got a bit tipsy and told Brandon everything. Brandon, who'd rapidly become my best friend, who I thought I could trust with anything. And his response, I probably misinterpreted Howie. That Howie was a good guy, he'd known him for years, and he'd never behaved like that towards him. Now just imagine me yelling loudly and incoherently at this point. So that was just me done with that job, but not before Howie had one final trick up his sleeve. Again, he called me into his office and this time made me sit on his side of the desk, which I reluctantly did because as much as it sickened me, I needed to part on good terms so I could get the references I needed. Now I couldn't believe what I was seeing when Howie pulled up the folder on his computer. It was a series of photos of Jono taken with a telephoto lens like they'd been snapped by some kind of private detective, and they chronicled his daily movements since we'd broken up. Now I stared at Howie, who looked at me like he was extremely proud of himself, and he went on to explain that now we had a good enough data on Jono's day-to-day activities that we could surely make it look like an accident. Make what look like an accident, I asked. But of course I already knew. Howie had it in his head that together we were going to kill Jono to restore my honor, and then what? I dropped my panties for this balding middle management a-hole because he roped me into committing murder? Now I told him that I severely appreciated the effort he'd gone to and asked him if he could just email his dossier over to me so I could spend the night coming up with a plan. And that buffoon actually did it. He emailed me the photos, his random, barely legible .txt documents about how we could hit Howie with a car or cause him to walk under some unstable structures, or all manner of Looney Tunes nonsense. But his most coherent idea by far was that we'd invite him to the restaurant under the guise of me wanting to get back together with him and then serve him poisoned food. I immediately called the cops and forwarded all the information. Thankfully, they took it extremely seriously and apprehended Howie that same night on intention to commit murder. Eventually, he entered into some kind of plea deal and it was proven that he was most definitely not of sound mind, and really I didn't care as long as he got the help that he needed and wasn't a danger to others. But for me, I was left pretty devastated. First Jono, then Howie, then Brandon. I didn't really have any close female friends, so it just felt to me like everybody I'd gotten close to had turned out to be a goddamn psychopath. And honestly, I'm still struggling to shed that belief. I'm in therapy, but every time I meet a new person, every time they're nice to me, I find myself gripped with the terror of waiting for the other shoe to drop, as they say. All because I followed up on the help wanted sign in the window of my favorite local restaurant. They say you are what you eat. But frankly, I do not remember crazy being on the menu. My first job at a restaurant did not last all that long. I messed up, and I messed up big. It was a small Greek restaurant, all low-light mood lighting and authentic music. The owner, Mr. Tavaloris, was a larger-than-life character who could be the friendliest, funniest guy in the world unless he was in one of his moods, and then merely being in the restaurant felt like life or death. A couple of weeks into my work there, I was a waiter. Mr. Tavalorius came to me and told me inexplicably that I'd be in charge of front of the house. Not only that, it was going to be a quiet night, so I'd be the only waitstaff on hand, and to call his brother if things got out of hand and I needed a hand. Alternatively, if we had no diners arrive by 9 p.m., I was to shut up shop early, send the sole member of the kitchen staff home, and then hang around until my shift ended at 11, cleaning up and keeping an eye on the place. I didn't really like the sound of this, so I politely asked why I needed to stick around. Tavalorius told me that a guy might be dropping by, but don't worry, he was a professional, and I'd know what was up when I met him. Now this was classic Mr. T. He liked to turn everything into an epic mystery saga. I'm not sure if he had a poor grasp of the English language or just liked to pretend he did. And there was a rumor circulating some years later that he wasn't even Greek and had ever even been to Europe. And having worked for the man even for a couple of weeks, I honestly could believe this. 9 p.m. came and went, and we hadn't had a single customer all night. I sent the chef, an extremely young woman by the name of Maria, home early and went about doing God knows what, and I set the sign to closed, did a half-assed job of cleaning up the already immaculate restaurant, and ended up playing my Game Boy Color. Now, this was back in those days. Now, near 10 p.m., there was an urgent knock at the front door. I paused whatever game I was playing and headed over to alert the potential customer that, sorry, we'd closed, and no, I didn't know why, but them's were the breaks. And then I remembered that Tavalorius had told me to expect a guy, and it was pretty clear looking through the glass door that this was the guy that I'd be expecting. It was an exterminator, all kitted out in gear, and I could see his purple van parked back over in the handicap spot, and that the guy had a hand-rolled cigarette hanging between his lips. The label on his jumpsuit read, Roach a Go-Go. It was cute, so I just let him in. He told me in a thick Serbian accent that I had been expecting him. Didn't ask, just told. And I was like, sure, buddy, you're the guy, right? And he seemed to like this, declaring that yes, he was the guy, and he had a problem to take care of for Tavaloris before things got out. The exterminator told me that he had to go work in the kitchen, and this kind of unnerved me because what the hell did we have living in our kitchen? I asked him and he said not to worry, it was preventative, that Tavaloris' bosses didn't like the idea of rats in their establishment. I didn't even know Tavaloris had a boss. I'd always assumed that he owned the restaurant, but hey, I guess this all made sense. And so the exterminator headed through, and maybe my alarm bell should have rang when all he took in with him was a huge black plastic crate that he held by a handle. But what the heck did I know about extermination and laying poison or rat traps? The guy wasn't in the kitchen too long. He quickly stepped out of the door, too quickly, I realized much later, and then clicked the latch shut. The fella told me that I should just go home and leave the kitchen overnight for the poison to settle and deter any rats. None of this seemed weird to me, and Tavaloris had basically told me the same thing, to go home early, so I ushered the roaches a go-go to his van and bid him a good night and got into my own battered Buick 8, my pride and joy. Now I'm just going to jump ahead a little here and explain something about what Tavaloris actually intended by having me stay alone at the restaurant. Now he was expecting some very angry guys to show up and punish him for some transgression or other because, shock and horror, my dodgy Greek boss was in with the mob. Gasp. Who could have seen that coming? And so what he figured, I think, was that this mob boss's thugs would find me there alone, figured that I might be a big deal to Tavaloris, and dish out a beating that I wouldn't soon forget. At least I hope he only expected a beating. The idea that I was being cast out as a sacrificial lamb is a little too terrifying to actually consider. The thing is, these mob guys were smart, smarter than your average gangster. They didn't play things by dishing out beatings and burying Joe loose lips in concrete or whatever these guys usually did. They specialized in fear. I heard later that their enforcers were nicknamed the Ghouls, and I can understand why. Their intimidation came in the style of scaring the absolute living crap out of their target, and their target was Tavaloris, not me. Unfortunately, it was still me and the kitchen girl from the night before, Elle, who made the discovery. Tavaloris had arranged for us to open up that next morning, too, maybe to test if I'd actually show up for work, get a vague scope of the situation. I did indeed show up to work, none the wiser, and explained to Elle as we entered the restaurant that the exterminator had been there the night before and laid down poison in the kitchen to deter rats. Now, Elle was young, probably too young to be running a kitchen, but she was whip smart, and immediately her face went whiter than usual as she told me, "Hey, that's not how an exterminator works. You can't just lay rat poison down in the kitchen where we prepare food." This was effed. We were probably going to have to dispose of any of the food the exterminator had access to. And thankfully that shouldn't have been very much, since the pantry and the freezer were locked and Elle and another chef kept the key, but at the very least, we might have to replace some pans and some fresh veggies. That's a bummer, I thought as I opened the door. And then the next thing I'm doing is letting out the most high-pitched, girlish scream of my life. I slammed the door shut and began trembling, shaking like I was in septic shock. I could barely get my words out. I was almost sobbing, and bear in mind, I'm a grown-ass man. Elle was shaking me, asking me what the hell was wrong. Was someone dead in there? Did we have to call the cops? Now, she moved to open the kitchen door, and I just about screamed no. I think I scared her more by grabbing her than anything else, at least until she looked through the window into the kitchen. To Elle's credit, she wasn't quite as freaked out as me, but she didn't suffer from crippling arachnophobia. You see, the thing is, the kitchen was absolutely filled with bugs. These were the same type of bugs, mostly around the same size, about 4 inches long maybe, and at first I thought they were spiders. But Elle, who was able to study them a bit more, pointed out that they had 10 legs and not 8. There were hundreds of them. They were just sort of milling around the kitchen, kind of just hanging out. And at first I couldn't believe that they were real. They looked like spiders by way of some messed up horror writer and then some, and this was freaking New Jersey, not the Australian outback or the Middle East. Things like this just didn't live here. House centipedes were bad enough, but seeing the kitchen of our restaurant filled with these monsters was enough to absolutely break me. I begged, pleaded with Elle to latch the door back up, and broke into a sobbing pile on the floor as she called Tavaloris. And the man himself showed up 10 minutes later, furious that we interrupted him. Of course, there weren't monster spiders in the kitchen. Maybe a handful had gotten in, sure, but we must have both lost it. I didn't even have time to tell him about the exterminator or yell for him not to enter the kitchen before he unlatched the door and stormed straight in. Now, I've never seen a fat, unfit man run quite so fast as I did then. Tavaloris came crashing out of the kitchen, hollering and howling, yelling at us for not telling him what to expect and cursing the redacted family who I don't want to draw the ire of even to today. Elle thankfully had the foresight to rush over and pull the door shut, locking it again. But not before a couple of these beasts had come ambling out into the restaurant. Elle somehow managed to trap one of them under a glass, and the others started coming towards me. It looked at me, and I looked at it. Its face looked like, well, let's just say it looked like lady parts. Somehow this made this hideous spider being a little less terrifying to me, and I couldn't really bring myself to kill it. And instead, I slowly backed away and let Elle capture that one too. But there was still the problem of the absolute hundreds of these horrible bugs in the kitchen. Tavaloris was just screaming, "No cops, no cops," and eventually calmed down enough to call an actual exterminator pal of his. Elle and I were sent home for the day, and the restaurant was closed for the next 3. Needless to say, I didn't return to work when my unpaid, I may add, vacation was over. I was done with that job. If Tavaloris had pissed off the redacted family, then I did not want to go between him and the ghouls. Now, this was their harmless warning, their opening gambit, so to speak. Things would escalate from here, and I wanted no part of that. Now, I later found out from Elle that the creatures were camel spiders. Not spiders at all, or were they scorpions, despite their other name of wind scorpion. They're wholly their own thing. Not really dangerous at all, but they do have a painful bite. But what creeped me out the most was that the ghouls had collected enough of these to release around 100 into our kitchen, and you could bet money that this wasn't the only stock of horrific creatures and creepy crawlies that they actually had. It made me sure of one thing. I didn't want to work in the service industry. I didn't want to work with anyone who messed with that redacted family or became the target of the ghouls. And I certainly didn't want to find out the kind of thing that they do to escalate if releasing 100 camel spiders into a restaurant was their initial warning. A few years later, long after I had moved out of New Jersey, I heard that Tavaloris restaurant had closed down, some kind of health inspection issue. Apparently it was really bad. A guest had found a baby bird fetus in their falafel or something. Whether this was another threat from the ghouls or just Tavaloris being a really terrible restaurant owner, I'll never know. And really, I never want to know. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. I'd love to see you there. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over to my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Check it out. All links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.